Grizzly Malls, entire wedding party in National Park. September 17th, 2025. The morning of September 17th, 2025, dawned crisp and clear over Glacier National Park, Montana. At 6,847 feet above sea level, the air carried the sharp bite of early autumn, promising what meteorologists would later describe as perfect weather for an outdoor celebration. The temperature hovered at 42 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity at 38% and virtually no wind. Visibility extended for miles across the Continental Divide, where peaks like Mount Cleveland and Mount Jackson stood sentinel against an azure sky unmarred by even the faintest wisp of cloud. Sarah Elizabeth Hartwell, 28 years old and a pediatric nurse from Kalispell, Montana, had dreamed of this day since she was 7 years old, when her grandmother had shown her a faded photograph of her own wedding ceremony held in the same region 63 years earlier. Sarah stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, with auburn hair that caught the morning light like spun copper and green eyes that reflected the wilderness she had grown to love during her childhood summers spent camping with her family throughout the crown of the continent ecosystem. Her hands, steady and sure from years of caring for sick children, trembled slightly as she adjusted her grandmother's antique pearl necklace, a family heirloom that had been worn by 4 generations of Hartwell women on their wedding days. Michael James Thompson, 31, stood 6 feet 2 inches tall with the broad shoulders and calloused hands of a man who had spent his entire adult life as a wilderness guide and search and rescue coordinator for Flathead County. His dark brown hair was cut short in a style that remained professional even after days in the backcountry, and his hazel eyes held the kind of steady confidence that came from having pulled dozens of injured hikers off treacherous mountain faces and having spent more nights sleeping under the stars than in his own bed. He had proposed to Sarah exactly 18 months earlier on this very spot, a remote meadow accessible only by the Highline Trail, 7 miles from the nearest parking area at Logan Pass. The location they had chosen for their ceremony was breathtaking in its isolation and beauty. Hidden Creek Meadow sat at an elevation of 6,200 feet, nestled in a natural amphitheater formed by towering peaks on 3 sides. To the west, the jagged silhouette of the garden wall rose nearly 2,000 feet above the meadow floor, its ancient sedimentary layers telling the geological story of millions of years. To the north and east, Mount Gould and Mount Grinnell dominated the horizon, their snow-covered peaks reflecting the morning sun with an intensity that required sunglasses to view directly. The meadow itself stretched roughly 3 acres, carpeted with native grasses that had begun their seasonal transition from summer green to autumn gold. Scattered throughout were patches of wild huckleberries, their dark purple fruit having ripened just weeks earlier, and clusters of Indian paintbrush that added splashes of crimson to the landscape. What made this location particularly special was its remoteness and the effort required to reach it. The Highline Trail, constructed by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s, wound its way along the Continental Divide for 11 miles from Logan Pass to Granite Park Chalet. Hidden Creek Meadow lay approximately 7 miles along this route, accessible only by a narrow, unmarked path that branched off from the main trail and descended 200 feet through a dense grove of subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce. The GPS coordinates were 48.7156 degrees north, 113.7892 degrees west, placing it firmly within the boundaries of Glacier National Park, in habitat that was home to approximately 300 grizzly bears and an estimated 600 black bears. Michael had first discovered this meadow during a solo backpacking trip in the summer of 2019. As a certified Level 2 search and rescue technician and a member of the Glacier National Park backcountry response team, he possessed the wilderness skills and local knowledge that allowed him to safely navigate off-trail terrain that would be dangerous for most visitors. He had been tracking a missing hiker, a 64-year-old man from Ohio who had become separated from his group during a day hike when he had noticed the faint game trail that led to the meadow. The missing hiker was eventually found safe at the Granite Park Chalet, having taken a wrong turn, but possessing enough basic wilderness knowledge to stay on established trails until he reached help. But Michael never forgot the hidden meadow, returning to it multiple times over the following years, always alone, always feeling like he had discovered a secret that the mountains were sharing with him personally. The decision to hold their wedding in such a remote location had not been made lightly. Sarah and Michael had spent months researching the legal requirements for outdoor ceremonies in national parks, discovering that they would need a special use permit from the National Park Service, which cost $150 and required a detailed written plan including exact coordinates, expected number of guests, and comprehensive logistics for waste management and leave-no-trace compliance. They had submitted their application in January 2025, 8 months before their planned ceremony date, knowing that permits for weddings in Glacier National Park were limited to fewer than a dozen per year and were granted only to couples who could demonstrate exceptional wilderness experience and provide detailed safety plans. The permit process had been rigorous. Park Superintendent Jennifer Martinez Collins, a 47-year-old career National Park Service employee with 23 years of experience in wilderness management, had personally reviewed their application. Martinez Collins, who held a master's degree in wildlife biology from the University of Montana and had previously served as chief ranger at Yellowstone National Park, was known for her strict interpretation of regulations designed to protect both park resources and visitor safety. She had required Sarah and Michael to submit not only their wilderness resumes, but also detailed weather contingency plans, emergency evacuation procedures, and proof of comprehensive liability insurance. Michael's credentials had been impressive. In addition to his search and rescue experience, he held certifications as a wilderness first aid instructor, an avalanche safety specialist, and a licensed hunting guide. He had completed the National Park Service's Advanced Wilderness Medicine course at the NOLS Wilderness Medicine Institute in Wyoming and had participated in 47 search and rescue operations over the previous 6 years, including 3 grizzly bear encounters that had ended without injury to humans or bears. His knowledge of bear behavior and safety protocols was considered among the best in the region. Sarah's wilderness experience, while not as extensive as Michael's, was nonetheless substantial. She had completed a wilderness first responder course and had volunteered as a camp nurse at a summer program for disadvantaged youth that took children on week-long backpacking trips throughout the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. She had also spent 5 summers working as a seasonal employee at Glacier National Park, serving as a naturalist at the Apgar Visitor Center, where she had given hundreds of presentations on wildlife safety and had personally handled 17 bear encounters involving park visitors. The guest list had been carefully limited to 18 people, all of whom possessed significant wilderness experience. This requirement had been both a practical necessity and a deliberate choice by Sarah and Michael, who wanted their wedding to be attended only by people who truly understood and appreciated the wilderness setting they had chosen. Each guest had been required to demonstrate their fitness level by completing a 7-mile hike with a full pack, and all had been required to attend a mandatory safety briefing conducted by Michael 3 weeks before the ceremony. Ryan Matthew Carter, 29 years old and Michael's closest friend since their days together at Montana State University, would serve as best man. Ryan stood 5 feet 11 inches tall with blonde hair that he kept perpetually tousled and blue eyes that seemed to hold a permanent hint of mischief. He worked as a freelance outdoor photographer, specializing in adventure sports and wildlife photography that had been featured in publications including Outside Magazine, National Geographic Adventure, and Backpacker. His work had taken him to remote locations throughout North America, from the Arctic tundra of northern Alaska to the desert canyons of southern Utah. He had photographed grizzly bears on multiple occasions, including a memorable series of images he had captured in Katmai National Park, Alaska, showing a massive male grizzly catching salmon during the peak of the spawning run. Ryan's relationship with Michael went back to their freshman year at Montana State, where they had both majored in outdoor recreation with an emphasis on wilderness leadership. They had spent countless weekends exploring the mountains of southwestern Montana, developing a friendship based on shared adventures and a mutual love of wild places. Ryan had been with Michael on the solo trip when he had first discovered Hidden Creek Meadow, though he had remained on the main trail while Michael had followed the game path to explore the meadow. When Michael had returned with stories of the beautiful hidden location, Ryan had insisted on seeing it for himself, and the two friends had returned together the following weekend. Jessica Marie Williams, 26, would serve as Sarah's maid of honor. Jessica had known Sarah since their undergraduate days at the University of Montana, where they had both studied nursing, and had met in their first clinical rotation at St. Patrick Hospital in Missoula. Jessica stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, with curly brown hair and warm brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that she had worn since middle school. She worked as an emergency room nurse at Kalispell Regional Medical Center, where she had developed expertise in trauma care and had personally treated dozens of victims of wilderness accidents, including several bear attacks. Her experience with traumatic injuries would prove invaluable in the hours following the attack, though she could never have imagined that her skills would be needed at her best friend's wedding. The other guests represented a carefully selected group of family members and close friends, each chosen not only for their personal relationships with Sarah and Michael, but also for their ability to handle the physical and logistical challenges of an extremely remote outdoor ceremony. Sarah's parents, Robert and Linda Hartwell, were both 62 years old and lifelong residents of northwestern Montana. Robert worked as a retired Forest Service ranger who had spent 35 years managing wilderness areas throughout the Northern Rockies. Linda was a retired elementary school teacher who had spent her summers leading nature programs for children at various state parks. They had met in 1982 during a training program for wilderness first aid and had spent their entire marriage exploring remote areas of Montana, Idaho, and British Columbia. Michael's parents, David and Patricia Thompson, were 65 and 63 respectively. David was a retired airline pilot who had flown for Northwest Airlines for 32 years before the company's merger with Delta Airlines. Patricia was a retired registered nurse who had worked in the intensive care unit at Benefice Hospital in Great Falls for 28 years. Like Sarah's parents, they were experienced outdoors enthusiasts who had instilled their love of wilderness in their son from an early age. David had taught Michael to read topographic maps when he was 8 years old, and Patricia had insisted that he learn wilderness first aid skills by the time he was a teenager. Among the other guests were Sarah's brother, Thomas Hartwell, 31, a wildlife biologist with the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks, who specialized in grizzly bear research and had spent the previous 4 summers working on a collaborative study with the U.S. Geological Survey to track bear movements using GPS collars. His expertise in bear behavior would later prove crucial during the investigation into the attack. Thomas stood 6 feet tall with the same auburn hair as his sister and had inherited their grandmother's green eyes. He was married to Amanda Hartwell, 29, a veterinarian who worked at a practice in Whitefish that specialized in treating wildlife injuries for the state rehabilitation program. Michael's sister, Rebecca Thompson Mitchell, 33, was a park ranger at Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming, where she worked in the Visitor Center Protection Division and had extensive experience with human-bear conflicts. She was married to James Mitchell, 35, a hydrologist with the U.S. Geological Survey who studied the effects of climate change on alpine watersheds. Rebecca stood 5 feet 8 inches tall, with her father's dark brown hair and her mother's hazel eyes, and she possessed the kind of calm authority that came from years of dealing with dangerous situations in the wilderness. The remaining guests included Michael's uncle, Carl Thompson, 58, a retired hunting guide who had spent 40 years leading clients on wilderness hunts throughout the Northern Rockies, and had encountered dozens of grizzly bears during his career. Carl's wife, Margaret Thompson, 55, was a retired paramedic who had worked for nearly 30 years with rural ambulance services and had responded to numerous wilderness emergencies. Their son, Kevin Thompson, 27, worked as a helicopter pilot for a company that provided transportation services to remote locations throughout Montana and had extensive experience with mountain flying and rescue operations. Sarah's college roommate, Dr. Elizabeth Chen, 29, had flown in from Seattle, where she worked as an emergency physician at Harborview Medical Center. Elizabeth stood 5 feet 2 inches tall with straight black hair that she kept in a practical ponytail and dark eyes that reflected both intelligence and compassion. Despite growing up in urban environments, she had developed a love for the outdoors during her college years and had spent numerous weekends exploring the mountains of Montana with Sarah and Jessica. Her medical expertise would prove invaluable during the aftermath of the attack. The final guest was Father Miguel Rodriguez, 54, who would officiate the ceremony. Father Rodriguez served as the chaplain for the Glacier National Park Service and had performed numerous outdoor weddings throughout his 26 years of service. He stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, with graying black hair and kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses similar to Jessica's. Born and raised in New Mexico, he had developed his love for wilderness during seminary training and had specifically requested assignments that would allow him to serve in areas where his parishioners included both permanent residents and the millions of visitors who came to experience the natural wonders of the national parks. The logistics of getting 18 people, along with all the supplies necessary for an outdoor wedding ceremony, to a location 7 miles from the nearest parking area, had required months of careful planning. The total weight of supplies, including decorations, seating, food, and emergency equipment, exceeded 400 pounds. This necessitated multiple trips over several days, with different groups taking responsibility for carrying specific items. Michael had coordinated the effort with military precision, creating detailed packing lists and weight distributions to ensure that no individual would be required to carry more than 40 pounds, well within safe limits for the distance involved. The decorations alone represented a significant investment and logistical challenge. Sarah had dreamed of a ceremony that would complement rather than compete with the natural beauty of the meadow, but she also wanted the day to feel special and different from the countless outdoor events they had all participated in over the years. Working with a wedding planner from Whitefish who specialized in remote outdoor events, she had selected decorations that could be transported in lightweight, compact packages, but would create dramatic visual impact once assembled. The centerpiece of the decorative scheme was an archway constructed from local materials, but enhanced with artificial elements that could be packed in and packed out without environmental impact. The base structure consisted of 2 8-foot poles made from lightweight aluminum that could be telescoped down to 4 feet for transport. These were connected by a curved piece that would be decorated with battery-powered LED lights designed to look like tiny fireflies, along with artificial wildflowers that had been specifically chosen to match the native species found in the meadow. The total cost of the decorations was $8,200, which included not only the archway materials, but also fabric runners for the aisle, battery-powered sound equipment for music, lightweight chairs that could be carried in backpack frames, and table settings for the reception dinner that would follow the ceremony. The seating arrangement consisted of 18 ultra-lightweight folding chairs that had been designed for backpacking and weighed only 2 pounds each. These were arranged in 3 rows on each side of a natural aisle that led from the edge of the meadow to the archway, which would be positioned to take advantage of the dramatic mountain backdrop. Each chair was decorated with a small bouquet of artificial wildflowers tied with biodegradable ribbon that would be collected and packed out after the ceremony. The sound system represented a particular challenge, as the remote location meant that there was no electrical power available. Michael had invested in a portable system powered by rechargeable lithium batteries that could provide up to 8 hours of operation. The system included wireless microphones for the ceremony and speakers positioned to provide clear audio for all guests while minimizing noise that might disturb wildlife. The total weight of the audio equipment was 32 pounds, distributed among 4 different packs. Food service for the reception dinner that would follow the ceremony had been planned with the same attention to detail as the decorations. Rather than attempting to cook at the remote location, Sarah and Michael had arranged for a catered meal that could be transported without refrigeration and served at ambient temperature. The menu included locally sourced smoked trout, artisanal cheeses from a dairy in the Flathead Valley, fresh bread from a bakery in Whitefish, seasonal vegetables, and a selection of local wines and craft beers. The total cost of the catering was $1,800, and the food was packed in insulated containers that would maintain appropriate temperatures during the hike to the meadow. The wedding cake presented its own unique challenges. Sarah had initially wanted a traditional multi-tiered cake, but the logistics of transporting such an item 7 miles on wilderness trails proved impossible. Instead, she had worked with a baker in Kalispell to create a selection of individual cupcakes that could be packed in protective containers and assembled at the site to create the visual impact of a traditional cake. The cupcakes were decorated with buttercream frosting in colors that matched the wildflowers of the meadow, and the cake cutting would involve Sarah and Michael jointly selecting the first cupcake to share. Photography for the event would be handled by Ryan Carter, whose professional experience and familiarity with the location made him the obvious choice despite his role as best man. Ryan had scouted the meadow multiple times during the summer of 2025, taking test shots at different times of day to determine optimal lighting conditions and camera positions. He had determined that the ceremony should begin at 2 p.m., when the afternoon sun would provide dramatic side lighting that would illuminate the mountain peaks while keeping the wedding party from being backlit. His equipment included 2 camera bodies, 5 lenses ranging from wide-angle to telephoto, multiple batteries, and enough memory cards to capture several thousand images. The weather forecast for September 17, 2025, had been consistently favorable for weeks leading up to the ceremony. The National Weather Service office in Great Falls, Montana, had predicted clear skies with temperatures reaching a high of 58 degrees Fahrenheit and a low of 35 degrees overnight. Wind speeds were expected to remain below 10 miles per hour throughout the day, and the probability of precipitation was less than 5%. These conditions were considered ideal for outdoor activities at high elevation, and the forecast had played a significant role in the final decision to proceed with the ceremony as planned. The morning of September 17th began before dawn for most of the wedding party. Michael and his groomsmen had spent the night at the Granite Park Chalet, a historic stone building constructed in 1914 that served as a backcountry lodge accessible only by hiking trail. The chalet, located approximately 4 miles from Hidden Creek Meadow, provided basic accommodations including bunk beds, shared bathroom facilities, and a common dining area. Michael had reserved the entire facility for his group, ensuring privacy and eliminating any concerns about disturbing other guests with their early morning preparations. Michael woke at 4:30 a.m., his internal clock having been adjusted by years of early morning starts for search and rescue operations. He lay in his narrow bunk for several minutes, listening to the breathing of his sleeping friends and feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness that surprised him. As someone who had faced genuine life-and-death situations numerous times during his career, he found it remarkable that the prospect of getting married could produce such intense emotions. Through the small window near his bunk, he could see the first faint glow of dawn beginning to illuminate the peaks to the east. Ryan Carter was the second to wake, stirring at 4:45 a.m. when Michael quietly began moving around the room. Ryan's photographer's instincts immediately assessed the lighting conditions outside, and he felt a surge of satisfaction as he realized that the weather was exactly as predicted. The clear skies would provide the dramatic lighting he had envisioned for the ceremony, and the absence of wind meant that the decorative elements would remain stable throughout the event. By 5:15 a.m., all 4 men in the wedding party were awake and beginning their morning preparations. In addition to Michael and Ryan, the group included Thomas Hartwell, Sarah's brother, and Kevin Thompson, Michael's cousin. The morning routine included a substantial breakfast designed to provide energy for the day ahead, final equipment checks, and a review of the timeline that would govern the day's activities. Breakfast was prepared using the chalet's basic kitchen facilities and consisted of oatmeal with dried fruit and nuts, scrambled eggs, turkey sausage, whole grain toast, fresh fruit, and coffee. The meal was designed to provide sustained energy while avoiding foods that might cause digestive issues during the physical exertion of the day. The men ate in relative silence, each lost in his own thoughts about the day ahead. Meanwhile, Sarah and the female members of the wedding party had spent the night at a rustic cabin near Apgar Village, approximately 35 miles from Hidden Creek Meadow by road and trail. The cabin, owned by friends of Sarah's family, provided more comfortable accommodations than the chalet, including private bedrooms, full bathroom facilities, and a complete kitchen. However, it also meant that the women would need to begin their hike to the meadow earlier than the men, as they had a longer distance to travel. Sarah had awakened at 4 a.m., pulled from sleep not by an alarm, but by a combination of excitement and anxiety that had made deep sleep impossible. She had lain in bed for 20 minutes, watching the gradual lightening of the sky through the cabin's east-facing window and mentally reviewing all the details that needed to come together perfectly for the day to succeed. Finally, she had risen and begun the process of waking the other women in her party. Jessica Williams, Sarah's maid of honor, had slept fitfully and was easily awakened. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, Sarah's former roommate, had worked a night shift at her hospital just 3 days earlier and was still adjusting her sleep schedule to mountain time. Amanda Hartwell, Thomas's wife, had been awakened several times during the night by her 18-month-old daughter, who was staying with Amanda's parents in Whitefish, but whose absence had left Amanda feeling unsettled. Rebecca Thompson Mitchell, Michael's sister, had slept well and woke feeling energetic and ready for the day. Her experience as a park ranger had accustomed her to early morning starts and challenging outdoor conditions. Patricia Thompson, Michael's mother, had been too excited to sleep deeply and was grateful when Sarah began moving around the cabin. Linda Hartwell, Sarah's mother, had spent much of the night alternating between excitement for her daughter and worry about the remote location and potential hazards. The women's morning routine was more complex than the men's, as it included not only breakfast and equipment preparation, but also hair and makeup styling that needed to be completed before the hike to the ceremony site. Sarah had hired a professional stylist who specialized in outdoor events to travel to the cabin and provide services for the entire female wedding party. The stylist, Maria Santos, was a 34-year-old woman from Kalispell who had built a successful business providing beauty services for outdoor weddings, adventure elopements, and similar events throughout northwestern Montana. Maria had arrived at the cabin at 5:30 a.m., bringing with her a complete mobile salon setup that included portable lighting, battery-powered styling tools, and weather-resistant cosmetics designed to maintain their appearance during outdoor activities. Her approach to styling for outdoor events emphasized natural-looking results that would photograph well but would not be damaged by wind, temperature changes, or physical activity. Sarah's hair was styled in an elegant updo that incorporated small artificial wildflowers to match the decorative theme of the ceremony. The style was designed to remain secure during the hike to the meadow and to complement the vintage-inspired dress she had chosen for the ceremony. Her makeup was applied using long-wearing, water-resistant products that would maintain their appearance throughout the day while still looking natural and appropriate for an outdoor setting. The other women received styling that complemented their individual features while maintaining a cohesive look appropriate for their roles in the wedding party. Jessica's curly hair was styled in a half-up, half-down style that controlled her natural curl pattern while allowing some of her hair to flow freely. Dr. Chen's straight hair was styled in a sleek low ponytail, with face-framing pieces left loose to soften the look. By 7:30 a.m., all the women were ready to begin their hike to Hidden Creek Meadow. Their packs contained not only personal items, but also decorative elements, food service items, and emergency supplies. The total distance they would need to travel was approximately 9 miles, including the drive to Logan Pass and the 7-mile hike along the Highline Trail and the unmarked path to the meadow. They had planned to arrive at the meadow by 11 a.m., allowing 3.5 hours for a hike that would normally take 2.5 hours, providing buffer time for the additional weight they were carrying and the need to preserve their appearance for the ceremony. The drive to Logan Pass took 45 minutes, winding through some of the most spectacular scenery in North America. The Going to the Sun Road, completed in 1932 and designated a National Historic Landmark, climbed through multiple ecological zones as it crossed the Continental Divide. The women traveled in 2 vehicles, a large SUV driven by Rebecca Thompson Mitchell and a pickup truck with an extended cab driven by Amanda Hartwell. Both vehicles were equipped with 4-wheel drive and had been inspected and serviced specifically for this trip. As they drove through the early morning darkness, the women could see the first rays of sunlight beginning to touch the peaks around them. The temperature at valley elevation was 38 degrees Fahrenheit, but they knew it would be even colder at Logan Pass, which sat at 6,646 feet above sea level. All of them were dressed in layers that could be adjusted as the day progressed and the temperature rose. The Logan Pass parking area was nearly empty when they arrived at 8:15 a.m. During the peak summer season, the parking area filled to capacity by 7 a.m. most days, but September represented the beginning of the shoulder season when cooler temperatures and the approach of winter limited the number of visitors willing to undertake long hikes at high elevation. The parking area offered spectacular views in all directions, with the peaks of the Continental Divide rising dramatically on both sides of the pass. The women spent 15 minutes organizing their packs and making final preparations for the hike. Sarah took a moment to call Michael using her satellite phone, confirming that his group was on schedule and would begin their hike from Granite Park Chalet at 9 a.m. The satellite phone was one of several pieces of safety equipment that Michael had insisted on for the wedding, providing communication capability in areas where cellular service was non-existent. The Highline Trail began directly from the Logan Pass parking area, initially following a narrow path carved into the face of the garden wall. This section of trail was considered one of the most spectacular hiking experiences in North America, but it was also potentially dangerous due to its exposure and the steep drop-offs on the downhill side. The trail had been blasted out of solid rock in many places, creating a pathway that was barely wide enough for two people to pass. For the first mile, the trail clung to the mountainside with drops of several hundred feet to the valley below. Metal cables had been installed in the most exposed sections to provide handholds for hikers, but the exposure was still intimidating for anyone with a fear of heights. The women moved carefully along this section, taking time to enjoy the spectacular views while remaining focused on safe navigation. As they hiked, Sarah found herself reflecting on the decision to hold their ceremony in such a remote location. She and Michael had discussed the risks extensively, and both had concluded that the beauty and significance of the location justified the additional challenges and potential dangers. Both of them had spent enough time in grizzly bear habitat to understand the risks, and both felt confident in their ability to manage those risks through proper precautions and safety protocols. The bear safety measures they had implemented were comprehensive, and based on the most current research and recommendations from wildlife biologists and park service officials. All members of the wedding party carried bear spray, and several carried backup canisters. The bear spray canisters contained capsaicin-based deterrent that was effective at ranges up to 30 feet and had been proven to be more effective than firearms in stopping aggressive bears. Each person had received training in the proper use of bear spray, including practice with inert training canisters. In addition to bear spray, the wedding party had implemented noise discipline designed to alert bears to their presence while avoiding sudden surprises that might trigger defensive behavior. As they hiked, they maintained conversation at normal volume levels, occasionally calling out, "Hey, bear," when approaching blind corners or areas with limited visibility. This approach was based on the principle that most bear encounters could be prevented by ensuring that bears were aware of human presence from a distance that allowed them to retreat without feeling threatened. Food storage was another critical element of their bear safety protocol. All food items were stored in bear-resistant containers that met National Park Service specifications. These containers were designed to prevent bears from accessing food even if they were able to manipulate the containers with their claws and teeth. The containers were also required to be stored at least 100 yards from any sleeping areas and at least 12 feet above ground when possible. The wedding party had also planned their activities to minimize the duration of their presence in bear habitat. The ceremony and reception were scheduled to be completed within a 6-hour window from 2 p.m. to 8 p.m., with all participants beginning their return hikes before darkness fell. This timing was designed to minimize the likelihood of encounters with bears, which were generally more active during dawn and dusk hours. As the women continued along the Highline Trail, they passed several other hikers who were beginning day hikes from Logan Pass. Most of these hikers were headed to popular destinations like Hidden Lake Overlook or Haystack Butte, shorter hikes that could be completed in a few hours. The sight of the wedding party, with Sarah in her hiking boots and carefully protected wedding dress, drew smiles and congratulations from the other hikers. At approximately 9:30 a.m., after hiking for just over an hour, the women reached the point where they would leave the main Highline Trail and follow the unmarked path to Hidden Creek Meadow. This junction was marked only by a small cairn that Michael had built during one of his scouting trips, as official trail markers were not placed on unofficial paths. The path was barely visible, consisting mainly of game trails that had been used by wildlife for generations. Sarah paused at this junction, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness as she realized that they were now leaving the relative safety and security of the established trail system. From this point forward, they would be in truly remote wilderness, miles from help and completely dependent on their own skills and preparation. She took a deep breath of the thin mountain air and started down the narrow path that would lead to her wedding ceremony. The path to Hidden Creek Meadow descended approximately 200 feet through dense forest, consisting primarily of subalpine fir, Engelmann spruce and mountain hemlock. The forest was old growth, with some trees estimated to be more than 300 years old and reaching heights of over 100 feet. The understory was sparse due to the limited sunlight that penetrated the dense canopy, but included species like huckleberry, mountain ash, and various wildflowers that added color to the forest floor. As they descended through the forest, the women could hear the sound of Hidden Creek, a small stream that provided the water source that made the meadow possible. The creek originated from snowfields high on the surrounding peaks and maintained a consistent flow throughout the summer and early autumn months. The sound of running water became increasingly loud as they approached the meadow, creating a natural soundtrack that would provide a peaceful background for their ceremony. The first glimpse of Hidden Creek Meadow was breathtaking. As they emerged from the dense forest, the women found themselves at the edge of a natural clearing that seemed to have been designed specifically for their ceremony. The meadow stretched before them, roughly oval in shape and approximately 3 acres in size, surrounded on 3 sides by towering peaks that created a natural amphitheater. The grass was a golden color that seemed to glow in the morning sunlight, and wildflowers were scattered throughout in patches of brilliant color. Sarah stopped at the edge of the meadow and felt tears begin to form in her eyes as she realized that her dream was about to become reality. The beauty of the location exceeded even her highest expectations, and she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the opportunity to celebrate her marriage in such a spectacular setting. Jessica, standing beside her, reached out and squeezed her hand, sharing in the emotional moment. The women arrived at the meadow at 10:45 a.m., 15 minutes ahead of schedule. This gave them time to rest, have a snack, and begin the process of setting up the decorative elements for the ceremony. The early arrival was fortunate, as the setup process proved to be more time-consuming than anticipated, particularly the assembly of the archway that would serve as the focal point for the ceremony. The archway consisted of multiple components that needed to be assembled on site. The base supports were aluminum poles that telescoped to their full 8-foot height and were anchored using guy lines and stakes that had been designed specifically for use in alpine conditions. The curved top piece was constructed from lightweight carbon fiber and connected the 2 base supports, creating the framework for the decorative elements. Once the basic structure was assembled, the women began attaching the decorative elements that would transform the utilitarian framework into something beautiful and appropriate for a wedding ceremony. LED lights designed to look like fireflies were woven through artificial wildflowers that had been chosen to complement the native species found in the meadow. Battery-powered timer controls would activate the lights during the ceremony, creating a magical effect that would be particularly striking in the photographs. While Sarah and Jessica worked on the archway, the other women began setting up the seating area and preparing the space for the reception dinner that would follow the ceremony. The lightweight chairs were arranged in 3 rows on each side of a natural aisle that led from the edge of the meadow to the archway. Each chair was decorated with a small bouquet of artificial flowers tied with biodegradable ribbon Tables for the reception dinner were created, using lightweight folding tables that could be carried in backpack frames. These were covered with fabric runners that coordinated with the decorative theme and set with dinnerware that had been specifically chosen for outdoor use. Battery-powered lanterns were placed on each table, programmed to activate automatically as the sun began to set. By 11:30 a.m., the setup was largely complete, and the meadow had been transformed into an elegant outdoor wedding venue that maintained harmony with the natural environment. The total setup time had been just over 2 hours, well within the timeline that had been planned for the event. The women took a few minutes to rest, hydrate, and have a light snack before beginning their personal preparations for the ceremony. Meanwhile, Michael and his groomsmen had begun their hike from Granite Park Chalet at 9 a.m. as planned. Their route to Hidden Creek Meadow was shorter than the women's route, covering approximately 4 miles of established trail, followed by the same unmarked path through the forest. However, their packs were heavier as they carried the sound system, emergency medical supplies, and additional food and water for the entire wedding party. The men had slept well at the chalet and awakened feeling energetic and ready for the day ahead. Michael's nervousness had largely disappeared, replaced by excitement and anticipation as he realized that within a few hours he would be married to the woman he loved in one of the most beautiful locations on Earth. The morning air was crisp and clear, with visibility extending for miles in all directions. The hike from Granite Park Chalet to the junction with the unmarked path took just over 2 hours, following well-maintained trails that wound through spectacular alpine terrain. The men maintained a steady pace while remaining alert for wildlife, particularly bears, which were common in the area. They implemented the same noise discipline that the women's group had used, maintaining normal conversation levels, and occasionally calling out "Hey bear" when approaching areas with limited visibility. At approximately 11:15 a.m., the men reached the junction where they would leave the established trail system and follow the unmarked path to Hidden Creek Meadow. Michael paused at this point to contact Sarah using his satellite phone, confirming that her group had arrived safely and that the setup was proceeding on schedule. The brief conversation filled him with even greater anticipation as Sarah described the beauty of the meadow and her excitement about the ceremony. The descent through the forest to Hidden Creek Meadow was uneventful, though the men moved carefully due to the additional weight they were carrying and the need to protect the sensitive electronic equipment in their packs. The sound system, in particular, required careful handling to ensure that it would function properly during the ceremony. As they emerged from the forest into the meadow, the men were struck by the transformation that the women had accomplished in just over 2 hours. The meadow had been converted from a beautiful but empty natural space into an elegant wedding venue that seemed to perfectly complement its surroundings. The archway stood ready at the head of the natural aisle. The seating area was arranged with military precision, and the reception tables were set and waiting for the dinner that would follow the ceremony. Michael felt a surge of emotion as he saw the space where he would be married in just a few hours. The beauty of the setting exceeded even his expectations, and he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the friends and family members who had made such an effort to help create this special day. Ryan Carter immediately began assessing the scene from a photographer's perspective, visualizing the shots he would take during the ceremony and making mental notes about lighting conditions and camera positions. The reunion of the two groups was joyful, with excited conversations about the morning's hikes and the spectacular scenery they had encountered. Sarah and Michael shared a brief, private moment together, holding hands and looking out over the meadow where they would soon exchange vows. Despite the tradition that the bride and groom should not see each other before the ceremony, they had decided that the unique logistics of their remote wedding made such conventions impractical. With both groups now assembled at the ceremony site, attention turned to the final preparations that would need to be completed before the 2 p.m. ceremony. Father Rodriguez, who had hiked with the men's group, began reviewing the ceremony details and checking the sound system to ensure that his voice would carry clearly to all the guests. The wireless microphones were tested and found to be functioning perfectly, with battery levels showing full charge. Ryan Carter began setting up his photography equipment, including multiple cameras positioned to capture different angles of the ceremony. His main camera would be handheld, allowing him to move around the meadow to capture candid moments and different perspectives. Secondary cameras were mounted on tripods in fixed positions to ensure comprehensive coverage of the entire ceremony. Dr. Elizabeth Chen conducted a final safety briefing, reviewing emergency medical procedures and ensuring that all participants knew the location of the first aid supplies and emergency communication equipment. As an emergency physician, she was acutely aware of the risks associated with being in such a remote location, and she had insisted on carrying comprehensive medical supplies, including equipment for treating everything from minor cuts and bruises to major trauma. Thomas Hartwell, Sarah's brother and a wildlife biologist specializing in bear research, conducted a final review of bear safety protocols with all participants. Despite the comprehensive safety measures that had been implemented, he emphasized the importance of remaining alert and following proper procedures throughout the day. His expertise in bear behavior would prove to be tragically inadequate in the face of what was about to unfold. At 12:30 p.m., with the ceremony just 90 minutes away, the wedding party began their final personal preparations. Sarah and Jessica retreated to a small tent that had been set up at the edge of the meadow, where Sarah would change into her wedding dress and complete her final beauty preparations. The tent provided privacy while keeping her dress clean and protected from the outdoor environment. Sarah's wedding dress had been specially chosen for the outdoor ceremony, balancing elegance and formality with practical considerations for hiking and outdoor activities. The dress was made from lightweight, wrinkle-resistant fabric that would maintain its appearance despite being packed and carried 7 miles to the ceremony site. The design was inspired by vintage styles, but incorporated modern performance materials that would be comfortable during outdoor activities. The dress featured a fitted bodice with delicate lace details and a flowing skirt that reached just below the knee, allowing freedom of movement while maintaining an elegant appearance. The sleeves were 3/4 length, providing coverage appropriate for the mountain environment while still looking formal and festive. The color was ivory rather than pure white, a choice that complemented the natural surroundings and photographed beautifully against the backdrop of mountains and meadow. Sarah's shoes were a compromise between style and practicality, featuring low heels that would be stable on uneven terrain while still providing the formal appearance appropriate for a wedding ceremony. She had practiced walking in the shoes on various types of terrain during her preparation for the wedding, ensuring that she would be comfortable and confident during the ceremony. Her accessories included her grandmother's pearl necklace, a family heirloom that carried deep sentimental value, and pearl earrings that had been a gift from Michael on their first anniversary. Her bouquet had been created using a combination of artificial flowers that matched the decorative theme of the ceremony and preserved wildflowers that had been collected during previous visits to the meadow. Michael and his groomsmen used a less elaborate preparation area near the forest edge, where they changed into their formal attire and completed their grooming. Michael wore a navy blue suit that had been tailored specifically for the outdoor ceremony, constructed from lightweight, wrinkle-resistant fabric similar to Sarah's dress. His shirt was white with French cuffs, and his tie featured a pattern that incorporated colors found in the wildflowers of the meadow. The groomsmen wore coordinating grey suits with ties that complemented Michael's, creating a cohesive look that was formal enough for a wedding ceremony while remaining appropriate for the outdoor setting. All of the men wore hiking boots that had been polished to a high shine, a compromise between formality and the practical requirements of the terrain. As 2 p.m. approached, the guests began taking their seats in the chairs that had been arranged on both sides of the natural aisle. The seating arrangement had been carefully planned to ensure that all guests would have excellent views of the ceremony, while maintaining the intimate atmosphere that Sarah and Michael had envisioned. Family members were seated in the front row, with close friends filling the remaining seats. The weather conditions remained perfect, with temperature having risen to 54 degrees Fahrenheit, bright sunshine, and virtually no wind. The lighting was ideal for both the ceremony and for Ryan Carter's photography, with the afternoon sun providing warm, golden illumination that would make for stunning photographs. Father Rodriguez took his position at the archway, checking his notes one final time and ensuring that his wireless microphone was functioning properly. The sound system was performing flawlessly, providing clear audio that would allow all guests to hear every word of the ceremony. The battery-powered speakers had been positioned to provide optimal sound coverage while remaining unobtrusive and in keeping with the natural setting. At 2:10 p.m., the processional music began, and the ceremony officially commenced. The music, a classical piece that Sarah had chosen for its emotional significance and its appropriateness for the outdoor setting, played through the wireless sound system with crystal clarity. The acoustic properties of the meadow, surrounded by mountains on 3 sides, created natural reverberation that enhanced the music and gave it an almost ethereal quality. Jessica Williams, as maid of honor, was the first to walk down the natural aisle. She moved slowly and deliberately, taking time to appreciate the beauty of the moment and the spectacular setting. Her dress was a soft blue color that complemented the natural surroundings while photographing beautifully against the backdrop of mountains and sky. She carried a bouquet of artificial wildflowers that coordinated with Sarah's bouquet and the decorative theme of the ceremony. Ryan Carter, serving as best man despite his role as photographer, followed Jessica down the aisle. He had positioned his primary camera to capture the processional while relying on his secondary cameras to document other aspects of the ceremony. His experience as a professional photographer allowed him to fulfill both roles without compromising either responsibility. Michael took his place at the archway, feeling a mixture of excitement, nervousness, and overwhelming love as he prepared to see his bride walking toward him. The moment felt surreal, almost dreamlike, as if he were living in a perfect fantasy rather than reality. The beauty of the setting, the presence of their closest friends and family, and the anticipation of marrying the woman he loved combined to create an emotional intensity that took his breath away. Finally, Sarah appeared at the far end of the aisle, accompanied by her father, Robert Hartwell. The sight of her in her wedding dress, backlit by the afternoon sun and framed by the spectacular mountain scenery, created one of the most beautiful images that any of the guests would ever see. Ryan Carter's camera captured the moment, but even his professional skills could barely do justice to the stunning visual impact of the scene. Sarah walked slowly down the aisle, taking time to make eye contact with each of their guests and to fully appreciate the moment she had dreamed of since childhood. Her dress flowed gracefully as she moved, and the wildflower bouquet added a touch of natural color that perfectly complemented her outfit and the setting. Her face radiated happiness and love, and tears of joy sparkled in her green eyes. As Sarah reached the archway and took her place beside Michael, Father Rodriguez began the ceremony with a welcome that acknowledged both the significance of the moment and the spectacular setting in which it was taking place. His voice carried clearly through the sound system, and his words seemed to resonate with special meaning in the natural amphitheater of the meadow. Dearly beloved, Father Rodriguez began, we are gathered here today in one of the most beautiful places on God's earth to witness and celebrate the union of Sarah Elizabeth Hartwell and Michael James Thompson in holy matrimony. This place, surrounded by mountains that have stood for millions of years, reminds us of the permanence and strength that we hope will characterize this marriage. The ceremony continued with traditional elements that had been adapted to acknowledge the unique setting and the couple's shared love of wilderness. Sarah and Michael had written personal vows that spoke not only of their love for each other, but also of their commitment to protecting and cherishing the natural world that had brought them together, and that served as the backdrop for their marriage. Michael's vows spoke of his admiration for Sarah's strength, compassion, and adventurous spirit, qualities that had been evident from their first meeting at a wilderness first aid class 6 years earlier. He promised to be her partner not only in marriage, but also in their shared adventures and in their commitment to spending their lives exploring and protecting wild places. Sarah's vows expressed her love for Michael's integrity, courage, and deep knowledge of the wilderness that had become such an important part of their relationship. She promised to support his work as a search and rescue coordinator and to share in the risks and rewards of a life spent in service to others who ventured into the mountains. The ring exchange took place with the dramatic backdrop of the Continental Divide rising behind them, creating images that would be treasured for generations. The rings themselves had been crafted by a local artisan and incorporated small amounts of gold that had been panned from streams in the area, connecting them permanently to the landscape where their marriage was being celebrated. As Father Rodriguez pronounced them husband and wife, the LED lights woven through the archway activated automatically, creating a magical effect that drew gasps of delight from the assembled guests. The lights, designed to look like fireflies, twinkled against the artificial wildflowers and created an enchanting backdrop for their first kiss as a married couple. The kiss was captured not only by Ryan Carter's cameras, but also by several guests who had brought their own cameras to document the occasion. The images would later be described as some of the most beautiful wedding photographs ever taken, with the natural splendor of Glacier National Park providing a backdrop that no indoor venue could possibly match. As the ceremony concluded at approximately 2:45 p.m., the guests rose to their feet in spontaneous applause, the sound echoing off the surrounding peaks and returning to them as a natural amplification of their celebration. Sarah and Michael walked back down the aisle hand in hand, stopping to embrace family members and friends who had made the journey to share in their special day. The reception began immediately following the ceremony, with the guests moving to the tables that had been set up at the opposite end of the meadow from the archway. The catered meal was served buffet-style from insulated containers that had maintained appropriate temperatures throughout the day. The food was exceptional, featuring local ingredients and preparations that complemented the outdoor setting while providing the elegance appropriate for a wedding celebration. The smoked trout had been prepared by a local chef who specialized in traditional methods and featured fish caught from the pristine waters of Flathead Lake. The artisanal cheeses represented the best of Montana's growing reputation for dairy products, including varieties that had won awards at national competitions. The fresh bread had been baked that morning at a family-owned bakery in Whitefish, and the seasonal vegetables had been sourced from organic farms in the Flathead Valley. The wine selection included bottles from wineries in nearby states that specialized in varietals suited to the northern climate. The craft beers represented Montana breweries that had gained national recognition for their quality and creativity. Non-alcoholic beverages included fresh juices, sparkling water, and coffee that would be particularly welcome, as the temperature began to drop with the approaching evening. As the guests enjoyed their meal, conversation flowed freely, with much of it focused on the beauty of the location and the remarkable experience of attending a wedding in such a remote and spectacular setting. Many of the guests commented that they had attended dozens of weddings over the years, but none had compared to the unique combination of natural beauty, personal significance, and logistical achievement that characterized Sarah and Michael's ceremony. Ryan Carter continued his dual role as best man and photographer, capturing candid images of the guests enjoying the reception while also participating in the conversations and celebrations. His professional experience allowed him to document the event comprehensively while remaining fully present as a participant in the celebration. The toasts began at approximately 3:30 p.m., with Thomas Hartwell, Sarah's brother, serving as master of ceremonies due to his experience in public speaking through his work with the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Thomas spoke eloquently about Sarah's adventurous spirit and her love for the wilderness, qualities that had made her a perfect match for Michael. Jessica Williams, as maid of honor, delivered a toast that brought tears to many eyes as she spoke about her friendship with Sarah and her admiration for the courage it had taken to plan a wedding in such a challenging location. She praised both Sarah and Michael for their commitment to living life on their own terms and for choosing to celebrate their marriage in a way that truly reflected their values and passions. Ryan Carter's toast as best man was both humorous and heartfelt, recounting adventures he had shared with Michael over the years, while expressing his confidence that Sarah was the perfect partner for his best friend. He spoke about Michael's skills as a wilderness guide and search and rescue coordinator, but also about his loyalty, integrity, and capacity for love. The parents of both Sarah and Michael offered toasts that reflected their pride in their children and their gratitude for the opportunity to celebrate in such a beautiful setting. Robert Hartwell, Sarah's father, spoke about watching his daughter grow from a little girl who was afraid of hiking too far from the car into a confident woman who was comfortable planning her wedding 7 miles from the nearest road. David Thompson, Michael's father, expressed his admiration for both Sarah and Michael and his confidence that their marriage would be as strong and enduring as the mountains that surrounded them. Father Rodriguez offered a blessing that incorporated elements of traditional marriage ceremonies with acknowledgments of the natural setting and the couple's commitment to environmental stewardship. His words seemed particularly meaningful in the context of the pristine wilderness that surrounded them, and several guests later commented that they had never attended a more spiritually moving wedding ceremony. The cake-cutting ceremony began at 4:15 p.m., with Sarah and Michael jointly selecting the first cupcake to share from the artfully arranged display that had been created to simulate a traditional wedding cake. The cupcakes, decorated with buttercream frosting in colors that matched the wildflowers of the meadow, were both beautiful and delicious, representing another successful compromise between tradition and the practical requirements of the remote location. As the afternoon progressed, the temperature began to drop as the sun moved lower in the sky, but the celebration continued with undiminished enthusiasm. Several guests commented on the remarkable clarity of the air at high elevation, which made the surrounding peaks appear close enough to touch, despite being miles away. The lighting continued to be spectacular, with the golden hour approaching that would provide even more dramatic illumination for photographs. At approximately 4:45 p.m., the first signs of potential trouble began to manifest, though they were so subtle that they were noticed by only one person among the wedding party. Thomas Hartwell, whose expertise in bear behavior had been developed through years of field research, observed movement in the forest at the edge of the meadow that was inconsistent with the wind patterns or other natural phenomena he had been monitoring throughout the day. Thomas's initial observation was of branches moving in a section of forest where there was no wind, combined with a brief glimpse of something large and dark-colored moving through the trees. His first thought was that it might be a moose, as these large ungulates were common in the area and would be drawn to the water source provided by Hidden Creek. However, the movement pattern seemed wrong for a moose, which typically moved in a more direct, purposeful manner when traveling through forest. Thomas discreetly moved to a position where he could observe the forest edge more carefully while continuing to participate in the celebration. His years of experience studying wildlife had taught him the importance of maintaining situational awareness even during social activities, particularly when in habitat that was known to support large predators. He did not want to unnecessarily alarm the wedding guests, but he also felt responsible for monitoring potential safety threats. Over the next 10 minutes, Thomas observed additional signs that suggested the presence of a large animal in the forest surrounding the meadow. These included the sound of branches breaking, which was audible over the conversation and laughter of the wedding guests, and what appeared to be scratch marks on the bark of a large tree that had not been present when he had scouted the location 2 weeks earlier. At 4:55 p.m., Thomas's concerns intensified when he observed what appeared to be a large, dark-colored animal moving parallel to the tree line, approximately 50 yards from the edge of the meadow. The animal was only briefly visible through gaps in the forest canopy, but Thomas's trained eye recognized the distinctive rolling gait and massive build that characterized a grizzly bear. His heart rate immediately increased as he realized that their remote wedding celebration was being observed by one of North America's most dangerous predators. Thomas faced a difficult decision. His expertise in bear behavior told him that the bear was likely aware of the human activity in the meadow and was probably investigating out of curiosity rather than aggression. Most bear encounters in Glacier National Park ended without incident when proper safety protocols were followed. However, the current situation presented several factors that increased the risk of a dangerous encounter. First, the large number of people in the wedding party meant that evacuation would be slow and difficult, particularly given that most of the guests were wearing formal attire and shoes that were not designed for rapid movement over rough terrain. Second, the presence of food from the reception dinner created an attractant that might draw the bear closer to investigate. Third, the remote location meant that emergency assistance would take hours to arrive, even if they could successfully communicate their need for help. Thomas's training and experience told him that the best course of action was to immediately alert the other members of the wedding party and begin implementing their bear safety protocols. However, he was also aware that panic could create a more dangerous situation than the bear itself. Bears typically avoided humans and would likely retreat if given the opportunity to do so without feeling threatened or cornered. At 5 p.m., Thomas made the decision to quietly alert Michael to the situation, reasoning that Michael's experience as a search and rescue coordinator and wilderness guide would make him the best person to help manage the response. Thomas approached Michael, who was engaged in conversation with several guests near the reception tables, and discreetly indicated that he needed to speak with him privately. Michael immediately recognized the seriousness in Thomas's expression and followed him to a position near the edge of the meadow where they could speak without being overheard by the other guests. Thomas quickly explained what he had observed, describing the movement in the forest and his assessment that they were sharing the meadow with a grizzly bear. Michael's initial reaction was to scan the tree line himself, looking for signs of the bear that Thomas had described. His years of experience in bear habitat had taught him to trust the observations of qualified wildlife biologists, and Thomas's credentials and expertise were beyond question. Michael could see evidence of the bear's presence, including broken branches and disturbed vegetation that indicated the passage of a large animal. The two men quickly developed a plan for managing the situation. Their primary objectives were to avoid panicking the wedding guests while implementing safety measures that would minimize the risk of a dangerous encounter. They agreed that all food should be immediately secured in bear-resistant containers and that the wedding party should begin a slow, organized withdrawal from the meadow while maintaining noise levels that would alert the bear to their presence and intentions. Michael discreetly alerted Ryan Carter to the situation. Knowing that Ryan's photography equipment included telephoto lenses that might allow them to better observe the bear's location and behavior, Ryan immediately began scanning the forest with his longest lens, a 400mm telephoto that effectively brought distant subjects much closer for observation. Through his camera lens, Ryan was able to confirm Thomas's assessment of the situation. The bear was indeed a grizzly, identifiable by its distinctive shoulder hump, dished face profile, and massive build. Ryan estimated the bear's weight at approximately 400 pounds, making it a large adult that could be either male or female. The bear appeared to be in good physical condition, with a thick coat that was beginning to show the lighter coloration that grizzlies developed as they prepared for winter hibernation. More concerning was Ryan's observation of the bear's behavior. Rather than moving through the area in the purposeful manner typical of bears traveling to feeding areas or den sites, this bear appeared to be investigating the meadow specifically. It was moving slowly along the tree line, frequently stopping to test the air with its sensitive nose and to observe the human activity in the meadow. At 5:05 p.m., the situation escalated when the bear emerged from the forest at the far end of the meadow, approximately 150 yards from the wedding party. The bear stood in full view for nearly 30 seconds, during which time several of the wedding guests noticed its presence and began pointing and speaking in excited tones. The bear's posture was alert, but not immediately threatening, with its head raised to test the air and its ears forward in a position that indicated curiosity rather than aggression. Sarah was among the first guests to notice the bear, and her initial reaction was excitement rather than fear. Like most people who lived in northwestern Montana, she had seen bears before, though never at such close range. Her first instinct was to reach for her phone to take a photograph, a reaction that was shared by several other guests who had also noticed the bear's presence. Michael immediately recognized that the situation had moved beyond the point where it could be managed discreetly. The bear was now in full view of the wedding party, and the excited reactions of the guests were likely to influence the bear's behavior. He quickly moved to the center of the reception area and called for everyone's attention using a firm but calm voice that carried clearly across the meadow. "Everyone, please listen carefully," Michael announced. "We have a grizzly bear at the far end of the meadow. This is not an emergency, but we need to follow proper safety protocols. Please remain calm, avoid sudden movements, and do exactly what I tell you to do." Michael's announcement had the immediate effect of focusing everyone's attention on the bear, which was still standing at the edge of the forest, observing the human activity. The bear's presence created a mixture of fear, excitement, and fascination among the wedding guests, most of whom had never seen a grizzly bear in the wild, despite living in bear habitat. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, whose medical training had included emergency preparedness protocols, immediately began mentally reviewing the treatment procedures for bear attack injuries, while also assessing the evacuation routes that would be available if the situation deteriorated. Her emergency medical kit included supplies for treating major trauma, but she was acutely aware that serious bear attack injuries often exceeded the capacity of field medicine and required immediate evacuation to a trauma center. Father Rodriguez, whose experience as a park chaplain had included several wildlife encounters, began quietly praying for the safety of the wedding party while also preparing to assist with crowd management if the situation required evacuation. His calm demeanor and authoritative presence had often proved valuable in managing groups of people during stressful situations. Thomas continued to observe the bear's behavior, looking for signs that might indicate its intentions. The bear's posture remained alert but not aggressive, suggesting that it was investigating the human activity out of curiosity rather than viewing the wedding party as a threat or as prey. However, Thomas was also aware that bear behavior could change rapidly, particularly if the animal felt threatened or if it detected food sources that it wanted to investigate. At 5:07 p.m., the bear began moving closer to the wedding party, walking slowly along the edge of the meadow in a path that would bring it to within approximately 75 yards of the reception tables. This movement represented a significant escalation of the threat level, as it brought the bear well within the distance that wildlife experts considered the minimum safe separation between humans and grizzly bears. Michael immediately implemented the evacuation plan that he and Thomas had developed. "We're going to pack up quickly and leave the meadow," he announced to the wedding party. "Move slowly and deliberately. Do not run. Stay together as a group. If anyone has bear spray, have it ready but do not deploy it unless I give the specific instruction to do so." The wedding guests began moving toward their backpacks and preparing for departure, but the process was complicated by the formal attire that most were wearing and by the need to secure all food items in bear-resistant containers. Several guests were wearing shoes that were not suitable for hiking, and others needed time to change into more appropriate footwear for the journey back to the trailhead. Sarah and Michael found themselves in the surreal situation of ending their wedding reception due to the presence of a grizzly bear. Despite the potential danger, both later reported feeling more excitement than fear during these initial minutes of the encounter. The bear's presence seemed to add a wild, elemental quality to their wedding day that was somehow appropriate for a ceremony held in such remote wilderness. Jessica Williams, as maid of honor, took charge of helping Sarah change out of her wedding dress and into hiking clothes that would be appropriate for the evacuation. The process required several minutes and had to be conducted in the privacy tent that had been set up earlier for Sarah's preparations. During this time, the bear continued its slow approach toward the wedding party. Ryan Carter faced the difficult decision of whether to continue photographing the bear or to focus on packing his valuable camera equipment for evacuation. His professional instincts told him that he was witnessing a unique and newsworthy event that deserved to be documented. But his personal concern for the safety of the wedding party, and particularly his role as best man, made him hesitant to treat the situation as primarily a photographic opportunity. At 5:12 p.m., the bear stopped its approach and sat down approximately 60 yards from the wedding party, adopting a posture that wildlife experts would later describe as observational. The bear appeared to be studying the human activity with what seemed like curiosity rather than aggression. This behavior was consistent with research on grizzly bear behavior that had documented numerous instances of bears observing human activities from safe distances without attempting to approach or make contact. Thomas interpreted the bear's decision to sit down as a positive sign, suggesting that the animal was not feeling immediately threatened and was not exhibiting the kind of aggressive behavior that would typically precede an attack. However, he also recognized that the bear's proximity to the wedding party remained dangerous and that evacuation should continue as quickly as possible. The presence of food from the reception dinner remained a significant concern. Despite the comprehensive bear safety measures that had been implemented, the smells of the catered meal would be detectable by the bear's highly sensitive nose from considerable distances. Bears in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which included Glacier National Park, had learned to associate human food with easy meals, and food-conditioned bears were statistically more likely to become involved in dangerous encounters with humans. Michael made the decision to abandon all food items rather than spend time securing them in bear-resistant containers, reasoning that the immediate safety of the wedding party was more important than the financial loss represented by the catered meal. The decision would later be criticized by some park officials who emphasized the importance of never allowing bears access to human food, but most wildlife experts agreed that the immediate evacuation of people was the correct priority. At 5:15 p.m., the wedding party began their organized withdrawal from the meadow. The evacuation was led by Michael and Thomas, who possessed the most experience in bear habitat and the best knowledge of the terrain they would need to navigate to reach the safety of the established trail system. The group moved in single file, maintaining conversation at normal volume levels to ensure that the bear remained aware of their location and movements. The bear's reaction to the beginning of the evacuation was to stand up and resume its approach toward the area where the wedding party had been celebrating. This behavior was consistent with the bear's apparent interest in investigating the source of the food smells that had attracted its attention. The bear did not appear to be following the human group, but rather seemed focused on reaching the reception area where food had been present. Sarah, now changed into hiking clothes and appropriate footwear, walked near the middle of the group between her parents and Michael's parents. The transition from bride to evacuee had been accomplished in just a few minutes, but the emotional impact of having her wedding reception interrupted by a grizzly bear was still sinking in. Later, she would describe feeling a mixture of fear, disappointment, and strange exhilaration at being part of such an unusual experience. The group reached the edge of the forest and began climbing the steep path that led back to the Highline Trail. The ascent was more difficult than the earlier descent had been, both because they were now traveling uphill and because the urgency of the situation had increased their pace beyond the comfortable rate they had maintained during the morning hike. Several of the guests, particularly the older participants, began to show signs of fatigue as they climbed through the dense forest. At 5:20 p.m., when the wedding party was approximately halfway up the path through the forest, they heard sounds from the meadow below that confirmed their fears about the bear's interest in their food. The sounds included what appeared to be containers being knocked over and possibly torn open, suggesting that the bear had reached the reception area and was investigating the abandoned meal. Thomas, who was bringing up the rear of the group to ensure that no one was left behind, reported hearing sounds that were consistent with a bear investigating and possibly consuming human food. This development significantly increased the danger level of the situation, as bears that obtained human food were more likely to seek out additional human food sources and were statistically more likely to become involved in aggressive encounters with humans. The group continued climbing toward the Highline Trail, with Michael and Thomas maintaining regular communication using handheld radios to coordinate the evacuation. Michael had activated his satellite phone and was attempting to contact park officials to report the bear encounter and to request assistance. But the dense forest canopy was interfering with satellite reception. At 5:25 p.m., just as the leading members of the wedding party were approaching the junction with the Highline Trail, the situation took a dramatic turn for the worse. Thomas, who was still at the rear of the group, reported over the radio that he could hear the bear moving through the forest below them and that it appeared to be following their evacuation route. The sound of a large animal crashing through the dense forest vegetation was unmistakable, and the direction of movement suggested that the bear had left the meadow and was climbing the same path that the wedding party had used for their evacuation. This represented a significant escalation of the threat level, as it suggested that the bear's interest had shifted from the abandoned food to the human group itself. Michael immediately ordered the group to increase their pace while maintaining their organized formation. The wedding guests, already tired from the uphill climb and stressed by the situation, began to show signs of panic as they realized that they were potentially being pursued by a grizzly bear. Several guests later reported that this was the moment when the situation shifted from an interesting wildlife encounter to a genuine emergency. Dr. Elizabeth Chen moved to assist guests who were having difficulty maintaining the increased pace, while Father Rodriguez helped to maintain group cohesion by encouraging those who were falling behind. The formal attire that several guests were still wearing was proving to be a significant handicap, as dress shoes and restrictive clothing were not designed for rapid movement over rough terrain. At 5:27 p.m., the first members of the wedding party reached the junction with the Highline Trail, a moment that represented a significant improvement in their safety situation. The established trail system provided better footing and faster travel, and it also increased the likelihood that they might encounter other hikers who could provide assistance or serve as additional witnesses to their situation. However, the relief of reaching the established trail was short-lived. Thomas reported over the radio that the sounds of the bear moving through the forest were getting closer, and that the animal appeared to be moving faster than the human group, despite the difficult terrain. The bear's superior strength and agility in forest environments was allowing it to close the distance that the wedding party had gained during their head start. Michael made the difficult decision to split the group, sending the fastest and most experienced hikers ahead to seek help while keeping the slower members of the party together for mutual protection. This decision was based on search and rescue protocols that prioritized getting assistance as quickly as possible while avoiding the abandonment of people who were unable to maintain fast travel speeds. Ryan Carter, Kevin Thompson, and Rebecca Thompson Mitchell were selected to form the advance group that would hike as quickly as possible toward Logan Pass to summon help. All three were experienced hikers in excellent physical condition who could maintain a rapid pace over the remaining distance to the parking area. They carried satellite phones and emergency communication equipment that would allow them to contact park officials and emergency services. The remaining members of the wedding party, including Sarah, Michael, and the older guests, continued as a group at a pace that could be maintained by the slowest member. This group included everyone's parents, Dr. Chen, Father Rodriguez, Jessica Williams, and Thomas Hartwell, who refused to leave his position at the rear of the group where he could continue monitoring the bear's approach. At 5:30 p.m., as the two groups were separating and beginning to implement Michael's evacuation plan, the situation reached its crisis point. Thomas reported over the radio that the bear had emerged from the forest onto the Highline Trail, approximately 200 yards behind their position. For the first time since the encounter had begun, the bear was in direct visual contact with the human group on open terrain, with no obstacles between them. The bear's appearance on the trail was described by multiple witnesses as both magnificent and terrifying. Standing on the open trail, with the dramatic backdrop of the garden wall rising behind it, the grizzly appeared enormous and powerful beyond anything that most of the wedding guests had ever imagined. The bear's thick, dark brown coat caught the afternoon sunlight, and its massive shoulders and distinctive hump were clearly visible even at a distance of 200 yards. More concerning was the bear's behavior upon reaching the trail. Rather than turning away from the human group or displaying the kind of avoidance behavior that characterizes most bear-human encounters, this bear oriented directly toward the wedding party and began moving in their direction. The bear's pace was described as purposeful rather than casual, suggesting a level of interest in the human group that went beyond normal curiosity. Michael immediately ordered both groups to deploy their bear spray, removing the safety clips from the canisters and holding them ready for use. Bear spray was effective at ranges up to 30 feet, but the current distance between the bear and the wedding party was far beyond the effective range of the deterrent. The bear spray would only be useful if the bear approached to within a distance that would make an attack imminent. The advance group led by Ryan Carter began running toward Logan Pass, abandoning any pretense of maintaining a hiking pace in favor of covering ground as quickly as possible. Their objective was to reach the parking area and summon help before the situation with the bear reached a critical point. The distance to Logan Pass was approximately 4 miles, which could be covered in less than an hour by runners in good condition. The main group continued walking rapidly along the Highline Trail toward Logan Pass, but their pace was limited by the physical capabilities of the older members and by the need to stay together for mutual protection. Michael estimated that their travel speed was approximately 3 miles per hour, which meant that it would take them more than an hour to reach the parking area where help might be available. At 5:33 p.m., the bear significantly increased its pace and began closing the distance to the wedding party much more rapidly than before. The bear was now moving at what witnesses described as a lope, a ground-covering gait that allowed it to travel much faster than the human group while still maintaining control and awareness of its surroundings. Thomas, who was maintaining visual contact with the bear from his position at the rear of the group, reported that the animal was now approximately 150 yards behind them and continuing to close the distance. At this rate of approach, he estimated that the bear would reach their group within 5 to 10 minutes unless something changed to deter its advance. Michael faced a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His training as a search and rescue coordinator had taught him that groups should stay together for mutual protection, but his experience in bear habitat also told him that a large group of people might be more likely to trigger aggressive behavior than a smaller group or individuals. The bear's persistent approach suggested that normal deterrence measures were not working and that more drastic action might be necessary. The option of using bear spray remained available, but Michael knew that the spray would only be effective if the bear approached to within 30 feet, a distance that would put the entire wedding party in immediate mortal danger. His experience with bear behavior suggested that once a bear approached that closely, it was likely to be in an aggressive state that might not be deterred even by bear spray. At 5:35 p.m., Michael made the decision that probably saved most of the wedding party's lives. He ordered the group to spread out along the trail, reasoning that a dispersed group would be more difficult for the bear to approach simultaneously and would provide multiple opportunities to deploy bear spray if the bear focused on specific individuals. This decision was controversial among wildlife experts as it went against standard recommendations for groups to stay together during bear encounters. Sarah found herself walking between Jessica Williams and her mother, Linda Hartwell, approximately 20 feet behind Michael and Father Rodriguez, who were leading the group. Dr. Elizabeth Chen was positioned near the middle of the spread-out group, where she could provide medical assistance to anyone who might be injured. Thomas remained at the rear, continuing to monitor the bear's approach and provide updates on its location and behavior. The spreading out of the group had the immediate effect of making the bear's approach more difficult to coordinate, but it also had the unintended consequence of separating individuals from the group's collective protection. Each person was now more vulnerable than they had been when the group was tightly organized, but the group as a whole was less likely to be overwhelmed by a single aggressive action from the bear. At 5:37 p.m., the bear reduced the distance to approximately 100 yards and began displaying behaviors that Thomas recognized as precursors to aggressive action. The bear's ears moved from their forward, curious position to a flattened position against its skull, and its head lowered in a posture that wildlife experts describe as threat assessment. These behavioral changes suggested that the bear was transitioning from investigative behavior to potentially aggressive behavior. Thomas immediately radioed this information to Michael, who passed it along to the rest of the group with instructions to prepare for potential bear spray deployment. The wedding party members checked their bear spray canisters and removed the safety clips, holding the deterrent devices ready for immediate use. Several guests later reported that this was the moment when they truly understood that they were in mortal danger. The bear continued its approach, and at 5:39 p.m. it had closed the distance to approximately 75 yards. At this point, several members of the wedding party could clearly hear the bear's breathing and the sound of its claws clicking against the rocky surface of the trail. The bear's size was even more impressive at close range, with its shoulder height estimated at over 4 feet and its weight clearly in excess of 400 pounds. Michael began calling out to the bear in a loud, firm voice, using techniques that had been proven effective in some bear encounters. "Hey, bear! We're not a threat! Move away! Go on!" His voice echoed off the surrounding peaks, but the bear showed no indication that it was deterred by the human vocalizations. Thomas reported that the bear's body language continued to suggest increasing aggression, with the animal now moving in a more direct line toward the wedding party rather than following the meandering path it had used earlier. The bear's eyes were focused intently on the human group, and its posture suggested a level of determination that was inconsistent with curiosity or investigation. At 5:40 p.m., when the bear was approximately 50 yards from the nearest members of the wedding party, it suddenly broke into a charge. The transition from walking to charging was so rapid that it caught even Thomas, who had been watching for signs of aggressive behavior, by surprise. The bear covered ground with incredible speed, closing the distance to the wedding party faster than anyone had imagined possible. Ryan Matthew Carter, 29 years old and Michael Thompson's best friend since college, was the first person to be reached by the charging bear. Ryan had been part of the advance group that was supposed to seek help at Logan Pass, but he had fallen behind when he stopped to take photographs of the bear during the early stages of the encounter. His position at the rear of the advance group put him directly in the bear's path when it began its charge. Ryan had approximately 3 seconds to react to the bear's charge before the animal reached him. His first action was to deploy his bear spray, creating a cloud of capsaicin-based deterrent that should have stopped or redirected the bear's attack. The bear spray was deployed correctly and at the proper range, but the bear's momentum and apparent level of aggression were too great for the deterrent to be effective. The bear struck Ryan with its right front paw, delivering a blow that wildlife experts later estimated contained more than 1,000 pounds of force. The impact lifted Ryan off his feet and threw him approximately 15 feet from the trail, where he struck a large boulder with his head and chest. The sound of the impact was audible to other members of the wedding party from distances of more than 100 feet. Ryan's injuries from the initial blow were catastrophic. The bear's claws, which measured over 4 inches in length, opened deep lacerations across his chest and abdomen, puncturing his lung and severing major blood vessels. The secondary impact with the boulder resulted in a severe traumatic brain injury and multiple fractures of his ribs and spine. He lost consciousness immediately and would never regain it. The bear's attack on Ryan lasted less than 30 seconds, but the violence and speed of the encounter was beyond anything that most of the wedding party had ever imagined. The bear bit Ryan multiple times about the head and torso, inflicting wounds that were immediately fatal. Wildlife experts who later examined the scene estimated that Ryan died within 60 seconds of the initial impact, though his body continued to sustain additional injuries during the prolonged attack. Sarah Elizabeth Thompson, who had been married for less than 3 hours, watched in horror as her husband's best friend was killed by the grizzly bear that had interrupted their wedding reception. Her screams of terror and anguish could be heard echoing off the surrounding peaks for miles, and several hikers who were miles away on other trails later reported hearing what they described as the most heartbreaking sound they had ever heard in the wilderness. Michael Thompson faced the impossible decision of whether to attempt to rescue his best friend or to focus on protecting his wife and the other members of the wedding party. His training as a search and rescue coordinator told him that Ryan's injuries were likely fatal and that attempting a rescue would only result in additional casualties. His friendship with Ryan and his natural instincts told him to attempt to drive the bear away from his friend's body. The bear's attack on Ryan was observed by multiple members of the wedding party, all of whom would later require extensive psychological counseling to cope with the trauma of witnessing such extreme violence. The attack was also photographed by automated trail cameras that had been set up by researchers studying wildlife movement patterns, providing documentary evidence of the encounter that would later be used in the official investigation. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, whose medical training had prepared her to treat traumatic injuries, immediately assessed Ryan's condition from a distance and realized that his injuries were beyond the scope of field medicine. Even if the bear had immediately retreated and Ryan could have been evacuated by helicopter within minutes, his injuries would have been fatal. The massive blood loss and traumatic brain injury were incompatible with survival, even with the most advanced trauma care. As the bear continued its attack on Ryan, the remaining members of the wedding party faced their own immediate survival crisis. The bear's aggressive behavior toward Ryan suggested that it was likely to attack other members of the group, and their remote location meant that help was hours away, even if they could successfully communicate their emergency to park officials. Thomas Hartwell, whose expertise in bear behavior had been developed through years of research, recognized that the bear's attack pattern was consistent with predatory behavior rather than defensive behavior. Defensive attacks by bears were typically brief and focused on eliminating threats, while predatory attacks were prolonged and focused on killing prey. The bear's continued attack on Ryan after he had been disabled suggested that the animal was hunting rather than defending itself. The predatory nature of the bear's behavior meant that standard bear safety protocols were unlikely to be effective. Playing dead, which was recommended for defensive attacks by grizzly bears, would likely result in additional fatalities if the bear was hunting. Fighting back, which was recommended for predatory attacks, was difficult to coordinate among a group that included elderly individuals and people with no experience in physical confrontation with large predators. Michael Thompson made the decision to deploy bear spray in an attempt to drive the bear away from Ryan's body and to protect the other members of the wedding party from additional attacks. He approached to within 30 feet of the bear, the maximum effective range of bear spray, and deployed his canister directly at the animal's face and eyes. The bear spray had an immediate effect, causing the bear to retreat from Ryan's body and to exhibit signs of pain and disorientation from the capsaicin exposure. The bear shook its head violently, rubbed its face against the ground, and moved approximately 50 feet away from the location of the attack. However, the bear did not retreat from the area entirely, instead remaining in visual contact with the wedding party and continuing to display aggressive behavior. The temporary reprieve provided by the bear spray allowed Dr. Chen to approach Ryan's body and confirm what she already knew from her distant assessment. Ryan Carter was dead, having succumbed to his injuries within minutes of the initial attack. His body showed evidence of massive trauma that would have been fatal even with immediate access to a fully equipped trauma center. Sarah Thompson collapsed when Dr. Chen confirmed Ryan's death, overwhelmed by the horror of watching her husband's best friend being killed on what should have been the happiest day of her life. Jessica Williams and Linda Hartwell provided immediate support, helping Sarah to remain conscious and mobile despite her emotional trauma. The psychological impact of the attack would affect Sarah for the rest of her life, but her immediate survival depended on her ability to continue functioning despite the trauma. The bear's retreat provided the wedding party with an opportunity to continue their evacuation toward Logan Pass. But it also created the difficult decision of whether to attempt to recover Ryan's body. Michael's training told him that body recovery was a secondary priority compared to the safety of living people, but his friendship with Ryan made it emotionally difficult to leave his friend's remains in the wilderness. Father Rodriguez, whose experience as a chaplain had included numerous situations involving sudden death, provided crucial leadership during this critical decision point. He conducted a brief prayer for Ryan's soul while acknowledging that the immediate priority was protecting the living members of the wedding party. His spiritual authority and calm demeanor helped the group to accept the necessity of leaving Ryan's body and continuing their evacuation. At 5:45 p.m., the remaining members of the wedding party resumed their evacuation toward Logan Pass, leaving Ryan Carter's body on the Highline Trail approximately 6 miles from the parking area. The decision to leave Ryan's body was emotionally devastating for everyone who had known him, but it was necessary for the survival of the group. Park officials would later recover his body using helicopter evacuation, but not until the following day, due to the remote location and the continued presence of the aggressive bear. The bear's behavior following the attack on Ryan was unpredictable and continued to pose a threat to the remaining members of the wedding party. The animal remained in the area, sometimes following the group at a distance of 100 to 200 yards, sometimes disappearing into the forest only to reappear ahead of the group on the trail. This behavior was consistent with predatory stalking and suggested that the bear continued to view the humans as potential prey. Thomas Hartwell continued to monitor the bear's behavior and location, providing regular updates to the rest of the group through handheld radio communication. His expertise in bear behavior was crucial during this period, as he was able to interpret the animal's actions and provide advance warning of potential additional attacks. His assessment was that the bear was likely to attack again if the opportunity presented itself. The wedding party's progress toward Logan Pass was slowed by the emotional trauma of Ryan's death, the physical exhaustion of the extended emergency situation, and the continued threat posed by the stalking bear. Several members of the group were showing signs of shock and were having difficulty maintaining the pace necessary to reach safety before darkness fell. Dr. Elizabeth Chen provided medical support for group members who were struggling with the physical and emotional demands of the evacuation. She administered mild sedatives to Sarah Thompson and Linda Hartwell, both of whom were showing signs of severe emotional distress that were interfering with their ability to function. She also treated minor injuries that several group members had sustained during the rushed evacuation from Hidden Creek Meadow. At 6 p.m., the advance group led by Ryan Carter reached Logan Pass and immediately contacted park officials using the emergency communication system located at the visitor center. The report of a fatal bear attack triggered an immediate emergency response that included park rangers, wildlife specialists, emergency medical personnel, and law enforcement officers. However, the remote location of the attack meant that it would take considerable time for help to reach the remaining members of the wedding party. Kevin Thompson, Michael's cousin and a helicopter pilot with extensive mountain flying experience, was instrumental in coordinating the emergency response. His knowledge of the terrain and weather conditions in the area allowed him to provide crucial information to the rescue teams about landing zones and approach routes that would be safe for helicopter operations. His professional expertise proved invaluable in planning the rescue operation. Park Superintendent Jennifer Martinez Collins personally assumed command of the emergency response, coordinating resources from multiple agencies to address both the immediate rescue needs and the longer-term public safety threat posed by an aggressive bear in a high-use recreation area. Her decision to close the entire Highline Trail system to public access would later prove controversial, but was based on the assessed risk of additional bear attacks. At 6:15 p.m., the remaining members of the wedding party encountered their second life-threatening crisis when the stalking bear launched another attack. This attack targeted Thomas Hartwell, who was still serving as the rear guard for the group and monitoring the bear's location. Thomas had approximately 5 seconds of warning when he saw the bear beginning its charge, but his position at the rear of the group left him isolated and vulnerable. Thomas deployed his bear spray as the bear approached, creating a deterrent cloud that caused the animal to veer slightly from its direct charge. However, the bear's momentum carried it through the spray cloud, and it struck Thomas with a glancing blow from its left front paw. The impact knocked Thomas to the ground and opened deep lacerations on his left shoulder and back, but the deflected nature of the attack saved him from the fatal injuries that Ryan had sustained. Michael Thompson immediately rushed to his brother-in-law's aid, deploying his second canister of bear spray to drive the bear away from Thomas's prostrate form. The combination of the bear's exposure to capsaicin and the aggressive response from multiple humans caused the animal to retreat approximately 100 feet, providing enough space for the wedding party to assess Thomas's injuries and provide immediate medical care. Dr. Elizabeth Chen's medical expertise proved crucial in treating Thomas's injuries, which included deep lacerations that had severed muscle tissue and damaged blood vessels, but had not penetrated vital organs. She used supplies from her emergency medical kit to control bleeding and stabilize the wounds, while also administering pain medication and antibiotics to prevent infection. Thomas remained conscious throughout the treatment and was able to continue walking with assistance. The second attack galvanized the remaining members of the wedding party and eliminated any lingering hope that the bear might lose interest and retreat from the area. It was clear that the animal was actively hunting the human group and would continue to pose a mortal threat until they reached safety or the bear was neutralized by wildlife officials. At 6:30 p.m., the first helicopter from the emergency response team reached the area and began searching for the wedding party along the Highline Trail. The helicopter, a Bell 206 operated by Glacier National Park, was equipped with thermal imaging equipment that allowed the crew to locate the group despite the approaching darkness and the dense forest that bordered much of the trail. The helicopter crew's initial assessment was that the wedding party was still approximately 3 miles from Logan Pass and was being stalked by a large grizzly bear that represented a continued threat to their safety. The helicopter's presence caused the bear to retreat into the forest, but it did not leave the area entirely. The crew reported that the bear appeared to be an unusually large and aggressive individual that was displaying predatory behavior toward humans. The helicopter evacuation of the wedding party required multiple flights due to weight limitations and the need to maintain aircraft safety in the challenging mountain environment. The first flight evacuated Sarah Thompson, Linda Hartwell, Patricia Thompson, and Dr. Elizabeth Chen, prioritizing the individuals who were showing the most severe signs of shock and emotional trauma. The second flight evacuated Thomas Hartwell, who required immediate medical attention for his injuries. Michael Thompson insisted on being part of the final evacuation flight, along with Father Rodriguez and the remaining members of the wedding party. His decision to remain with the group until everyone had been evacuated was consistent with his training as a search and rescue coordinator, but it also meant that he spent nearly an hour on the ground with the continued threat of bear attack. The helicopter evacuations were completed by 7:15 p.m., with all surviving members of the wedding party successfully transported to Kalispell Regional Medical Center for medical evaluation and treatment. The evacuation operation was considered a success by emergency response standards, but it came too late to save Ryan Carter's life and left lasting psychological trauma on everyone who had witnessed the attack. Ryan Carter's body was recovered the following day by a specialized team that included park rangers, wildlife specialists, and members of the Flathead County Sheriff's Office. The recovery operation required the use of helicopters and armed personnel due to the continued presence of the aggressive bear in the area. Ryan's body was transported to the Montana State Crime Laboratory in Missoula for autopsy and forensic examination. The autopsy, conducted by Dr. Amanda Richardson, the state's chief medical examiner, confirmed that Ryan Carter had died from massive trauma inflicted by a grizzly bear. The cause of death was determined to be exsanguination resulting from multiple deep lacerations that severed major blood vessels, combined with traumatic brain injury caused by blunt force trauma to the head. Dr. Richardson estimated that death had occurred within 2 to 3 minutes of the initial attack. The autopsy also revealed defensive wounds on Ryan's hands and forearms, indicating that he had attempted to protect himself during the attack. Analysis of tissue samples and photographs taken at the scene confirmed that the attacking animal was a grizzly bear, and DNA analysis would later be used to identify the specific individual responsible for the attack. The bear responsible for the attack was tracked and killed by park wildlife specialists on September 19, 2025, 2 days after the attack. The animal was identified as an adult male grizzly bear, weighing 487 pounds, making it one of the largest bears on record in Glacier National Park. The bear was estimated to be approximately 12 years old and was found to be in excellent physical condition with no signs of disease or injury that might have contributed to its aggressive behavior. Examination of the bear's stomach contents revealed evidence that it had consumed human food from the wedding reception, confirming the concerns that had been expressed about the bear's interest in the abandoned meal. Wildlife experts concluded that the bear's access to human food had likely contributed to its loss of fear of humans and its aggressive behavior toward the wedding party. The investigation into the bear attack was led by Special Agent Maria Santos of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, working in cooperation with park officials and local law enforcement agencies. The investigation examined all aspects of the incident, including the wedding party's safety preparations, the bear's behavior leading up to the attack, and the emergency response that followed. Agent Santos's investigation concluded that the wedding party had followed appropriate safety protocols and that their preparations had been more comprehensive than those typically seen in wilderness recreationists. The investigation found no evidence of negligence or improper behavior that had contributed to the attack, concluding instead that the incident represented an extremely rare example of predatory behavior by a grizzly bear toward humans. The investigation's final report, released 6 months after the attack, made several recommendations for improving bear safety in national parks. These included enhanced requirements for food storage in backcountry areas, improved bear safety education for wilderness recreationists, and increased monitoring of bear behavior in high-use recreation areas. The report also recommended against prohibiting wilderness weddings, concluding that the attack was an isolated incident that did not represent a systemic safety problem. The legal consequences of the bear attack were minimal, as the investigation had concluded that no individual or agency was negligent in their actions leading up to or during the incident. However, several civil lawsuits were filed by Ryan Carter's family against various parties, including Glacier National Park, the wedding party organizers, and equipment manufacturers. Most of these lawsuits were eventually dismissed or settled out of court. Sarah and Michael Thompson's marriage survived the trauma of the bear attack, though both required extensive psychological counseling to cope with the emotional impact of losing their best friend on their wedding day. They eventually returned to wilderness recreation activities, but never again planned events in remote locations that required extensive time in grizzly bear habitat. The wedding decorations that had been abandoned at Hidden Creek Meadow were later recovered by park personnel and determined to be a total loss, with an estimated value of $8,200. The catered meal that had been abandoned during the evacuation was consumed by the bear and other wildlife, representing an additional loss of $1,800. The total financial cost of the interrupted wedding was estimated at over $50,000, including medical expenses, legal fees, and lost personal property. The psychological impact of the bear attack extended far beyond the immediate wedding party to include family members, friends, and members of the emergency response team. A total of 37 people eventually received counseling services related to the incident, including helicopter pilots, park rangers, and medical personnel who had been involved in the rescue and recovery operations. The media coverage of the bear attack was extensive, with stories appearing in national newspapers, magazines, and television programs. The story was particularly compelling because of the contrast between the joyful occasion of a wedding and the tragic outcome of the bear encounter. Several documentary films were eventually produced about the incident, though the Thompson family declined to participate in most media projects. The Hidden Creek Meadow location, where the wedding had been planned, was closed to public access for 2 years following the attack, while park officials studied bear behavior patterns in the area and implemented enhanced safety measures. When the area was eventually reopened, new regulations required all visitors to carry bear spray and to complete enhanced bear safety training before being issued permits for backcountry access. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, whose medical expertise had proved invaluable during the emergency, was later honored by the American College of Emergency Physicians for her actions during the bear attack. Her quick thinking and professional skills were credited with saving Thomas Hartwell's life and with providing crucial support for other members of the wedding party during their emotional trauma. Thomas Hartwell's physical recovery from his injuries took 8 months and required multiple surgical procedures to repair damaged muscle tissue and restore full function to his left arm and shoulder. His expertise in bear behavior was instrumental in the subsequent investigation, and he eventually returned to his work with the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, though he specialized in research that could be conducted from safer distances. Father Rodriguez, who had provided spiritual guidance during the crisis, was later recognized by the National Park Service for his contributions to the emergency response. His calm leadership and spiritual support were credited with helping the wedding party maintain cohesion during their evacuation. He continued to serve as a chaplain for Park Service personnel and eventually officiated at memorial services for other victims of wilderness accidents. The Granite Park Chalet, where the male members of the wedding party had spent their final night before the attack, was renovated in 2026 to include enhanced communication equipment and emergency supplies. The improvements were funded in part by donations from the families of the wedding party members, who wanted to ensure that future visitors to the area would have better access to emergency assistance if needed. Jessica Williams, Sarah's maid of honor, required the most extensive psychological counseling of any of the survivors and was eventually diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder related to witnessing the bear attack. She took a leave of absence from her position as an emergency room nurse and eventually changed careers, becoming a counselor specializing in helping other victims of traumatic wilderness accidents. The wedding photography equipment belonging to Ryan Carter was recovered from the attack site and eventually returned to his family. The photographs and video footage that he had captured during the early stages of the bear encounter provided valuable documentation for the investigation and were eventually donated to researchers studying human-bear conflicts. The images were considered too graphic for public release, but were used for educational purposes within the wildlife management community. Kevin Thompson, Michael's cousin and the helicopter pilot who had coordinated parts of the emergency response, was later hired by Glacier National Park as a consultant on wilderness emergency procedures. His expertise in mountain flying and his personal experience with the bear attack made him particularly qualified to help develop improved protocols for helicopter evacuations in similar situations. The National Park Service implemented new regulations for wilderness weddings following the bear attack, requiring enhanced safety briefings, mandatory bear safety equipment, and improved emergency communication capabilities. The regulations also limited the size of wedding parties in remote locations and required all participants to demonstrate wilderness experience equivalent to what had been required for the Thompson wedding. Sarah Thompson eventually returned to her work as a pediatric nurse, but her experience during the bear attack led her to develop a special interest in helping children cope with traumatic experiences. She completed additional training in trauma counseling and eventually became a specialist in treating young patients who had been victims of animal attacks or other wilderness emergencies. Michael Thompson continued his work as a search and rescue coordinator, but his experience during the bear attack made him an advocate for enhanced bear safety education and improved emergency response capabilities in wilderness areas. He frequently spoke at conferences and training programs about lessons learned from the incident and was instrumental in developing new protocols for managing bear encounters involving large groups of people. The bear attack at Hidden Creek Meadow on September 17, 2025, remains one of the most thoroughly documented grizzly bear attacks in North American history due to the large number of witnesses, the comprehensive investigation that followed, and the extensive media coverage it received. The incident serves as a case study in wilderness emergency management and continues to influence bear safety protocols in national parks throughout the United States and Canada. Ryan Matthew Carter was buried in Mountain View Cemetery in Kalispell, Montana on September 22, 2025, following a memorial service that was attended by more than 400 people. The service included tributes from his photography clients, fellow outdoor enthusiasts, and members of the wedding party who survived the attack. A scholarship fund was established in his name to support wilderness photography education for young people. The anniversary of the bear attack is observed each year by the survivors and the families of those involved, though the observances are private and not publicized. Sarah and Michael Thompson visit Ryan Carter's grave each September 17th, maintaining a tradition of honoring their friend's memory while also marking the day that forever changed their lives and the lives of everyone who witnessed the attack. The story of the bear attack that interrupted Sarah and Michael Thompson's wedding serves as a sobering reminder of the inherent risks involved in wilderness recreation, even when comprehensive safety measures are implemented and experienced guides are involved. The incident demonstrates both the unpredictable nature of wildlife behavior and the importance of emergency preparedness when venturing into remote natural areas. The comprehensive emergency response that followed the attack, involving multiple agencies and dozens of personnel, illustrated the complexity of managing wilderness emergencies and the high cost of rescue operations in remote locations. The total cost of the emergency response was estimated at over $150,000, including helicopter operations, personnel expenses, and subsequent investigation costs. The bear attack also highlighted the challenges faced by national park managers in balancing public access to wilderness areas with safety considerations related to wildlife management. The incident contributed to ongoing debates about appropriate levels of human activity in prime grizzly bear habitat and influenced policy decisions about backcountry permitting and safety requirements. For the scientific community studying human-bear interactions, the attack provided valuable data about predatory behavior in grizzly bears and the effectiveness of various deterrent measures. The comprehensive documentation of the incident, including witness accounts, photographs, and forensic evidence, created a unique dataset that continues to inform research on bear behavior and safety protocols. The psychological impact of the bear attack extended far beyond the immediate participants to include the broader community of wilderness recreationists in northwestern Montana. Many experienced hikers and campers reported increased anxiety about bear encounters following the extensive media coverage of the attack, leading to changes in recreation patterns and increased demand for bear safety education. The attack also had significant economic implications for the local tourism industry, as some visitors chose to avoid areas known to have high concentrations of grizzly bears. However, the impact was temporary, and visitation to Glacier National Park returned to normal levels within 2 years of the incident. The Park Service's comprehensive response and improved safety measures helped restore public confidence in the safety of wilderness recreation. The story of Ryan Carter's death and the survival of the other wedding party members became part of the folklore of Glacier National Park, joining other legendary tales of wilderness survival and tragedy that have occurred in the region over more than a century of recorded history. The incident serves as both a cautionary tale about the dangers of wilderness recreation and an inspiring example of human courage and resilience in the face of mortal danger. The Hidden Creek Meadow location, once known only to a few experienced wilderness travelers, became famous throughout the world as the site of one of the most unusual and tragic bear attacks in recorded history. The meadow itself remains largely unchanged, its natural beauty unmarred by the violence that occurred there, serving as a reminder of the indifferent power of nature and the temporary nature of human presence in wild places. Today, more than 2 decades after the attack, the survivors continue to live with the psychological and emotional consequences of that September afternoon in 2025. Their experience serves as a testament to the healing power of time and the importance of professional counseling in recovering from traumatic events, while also demonstrating that some experiences leave permanent marks on the human psyche that can never be completely erased. The bear attack that ended Sarah and Michael Thompson's wedding celebration represents one of the most extensively documented and thoroughly investigated wildlife attacks in North American history. The incident provides valuable lessons about wilderness safety, emergency response, and the complex relationship between humans and large predators in shared landscapes. Most importantly, it serves as a memorial to Ryan Matthew Carter, whose death reminds us of both the beauty and the danger inherent in our relationship with the wild places that define the American wilderness experience. The next stories: Kodiak Bear destroys hunting cabin, kills father and son. October 21st, 2024. The morning mist clung to Karluk Lake like a shroud, obscuring the far shore where the ancient spruce trees stood sentinel against the Alaskan wilderness. William Turner adjusted his rifle strap and breathed in the crisp October air, tasting the metallic promise of winter on his tongue. At 43, he had been making this pilgrimage to Kodiak Island for nearly 2 decades, but this year felt different. This year, his 15-year-old son Jacob walked beside him, his first real hunting trip, his passage into manhood in the Turner family tradition. "Dad, how much further?" Jacob's voice carried a mix of exhaustion and excitement. They had been hiking for 3 hours since the float plane dropped them at the remote airstrip, their packs heavy with supplies for a week-long hunt. "Just over that ridge, son. Same cabin my father took me to when I was your age." William paused to check his GPS. though he knew these trails like the lines on his weathered hands. The Turner family had been hunting this area for 3 generations, ever since his grandfather first obtained the hunting lease in 1987. The cabin sat in a small clearing 2 miles from the lakeshore, a sturdy log structure built to withstand the harsh Alaskan elements. William's father, Thomas Turner, had reinforced it over the years with steel mesh over the windows and heavy wooden shutters. The door was solid oak, reinforced with steel bars, protection against the island's apex predators. As they approached the familiar structure, Jacob's eyes widened. "It's bigger than I imagined from your stories." William smiled, remembering his own first glimpse of the hunting cabin at age 16. "Your grandfather built this to last. See those claw marks on the doorframe? That's from a brown bear that tried to get in about 10 years ago." The cabin held. What William didn't mention was the recent reports from other hunters in the area. 3 separate incidents in the past month involving aggressive bear encounters. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game had issued advisories, but William had dismissed them as typical autumn bear behavior, animals preparing for winter hibernation. Jacob ran his fingers over the deep gouges in the wood, his expression sobering. The reality of where they were, truly alone in bear country, was beginning to sink in. Inside the cabin, William went through his familiar ritual of checking the propane, testing the radio equipment, and inspecting the emergency supplies. The cabin was well stocked with canned goods, medical supplies, and ammunition. A CB radio connected them to the outside world, though reception was spotty at best. "First rule of bear country," William said, pulling out a well-worn notebook where 3 generations of Turners had logged their hunting experiences. "Respect the wildlife, but never trust it. A bear can seem calm one moment and charge the next. They're faster than horses and stronger than trucks." Jacob nodded solemnly, unpacking his gear onto one of the 2 bunks. "Mum made me promise to be careful." Sarah Turner had been against the trip from the beginning. She had never liked William's annual hunting expeditions, and the thought of taking their teenage son into the wilderness filled her with dread. But it was tradition, and William had eventually worn down her resistance with promises of constant vigilance and frequent radio check-ins. As the sun began to set on their first day, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson, William cooked dinner on the propane stove while Jacob studied maps of the hunting area. The plan was simple: start before dawn, follow the game trails along the creek, and hopefully track a nice buck before the weather turned. "Tell me about the biggest bear you've ever seen out here," Jacob said, settling into his sleeping bag. William paused, considering. "That would be the fall of 2019. I was heading back to the cabin just before dark when I spotted him about 50 yards away. Massive male, probably 8 feet tall when he stood up. Had to weigh close to 1,200 pounds. "What did you do?" "Exactly what you're never supposed to do," I froze. Just stood there watching him for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. He eventually lost interest and wandered off, but I'll never forget the size of him, like looking at a living bulldozer. Outside, the wind began to pick up, causing the cabin walls to creak softly. Jacob pulled his sleeping bag tighter around his shoulders. "Are you sure the cabin's safe?" "Your grandfather made sure of that. These walls are 2 feet thick, solid log construction. The windows are reinforced, and that door could stop a tank." William reached over and turned down the propane lantern. "Get some sleep." We start before sunrise, but sleep didn't come easily for either of them. The wilderness is never truly quiet. The constant rustle of wind through trees, the distant call of loons on the lake, the occasional snap of a branch that might be nothing or might be something large moving through the forest. Around midnight, Jacob sat up suddenly. "Dad, did you hear that?" William was already awake, his hunter's instincts alert to the subtle change in the night sounds. The normal forest chatter had gone quiet, a silence that often meant a predator was near. "Stay calm," William whispered, reaching for his rifle. "Probably just a moose." But he knew it wasn't a moose. Moose were loud, crashing through the underbrush without concern for stealth. This was something else, something that moved with deliberate care. A low, huffing sound came from somewhere near the cabin's front door, followed by a deep, resonant grunt that made Jacob's blood freeze. "Bear!" William mouthed silently, his heart rate spiking. They lay motionless in their bunks, barely breathing, as the sounds continued outside. Heavy footsteps circled the cabin slowly, methodically. Whatever was out there was big, and it was investigating. The footsteps stopped directly outside the front door. In the silence that followed, they could hear their own heartbeats thundering in their ears. Then came the sound that would haunt Jacob's nightmares for the rest of his life. A deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the cabin walls. William had encountered bears before, but this was different. The animal outside wasn't just passing through or foraging. It was focused, purposeful. It had found something interesting. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds faded as the bear moved away from the cabin, but William knew it was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, watching and waiting. "Is it gone?" Jacob whispered. "For now," William replied, though he kept his rifle ready. "Try to get some sleep. We'll reassess in the morning," but neither of them slept. They lay awake, listening to every sound, every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind through the trees. Outside, the temperature dropped below freezing, and frost began to form on the windows. Dawn came grey and cold, with thick clouds threatening snow. William peered through the reinforced windows, scanning the tree line for any sign of their nighttime visitor. Fresh tracks in the soft earth around the cabin confirmed what they already knew. A large bear had spent considerable time investigating their shelter. "Look at the size of those prints," Jacob said, his voice tight with anxiety. The tracks were enormous, easily 12 inches long and 8 inches wide, with clear claw marks extending several inches beyond the pad prints. William had seen plenty of bear tracks over the years, but these were among the largest he'd ever encountered. "We stick to the plan," William said, though his confidence was shaken. "We stay alert, make noise when we're hiking, and we never separate. If we see this bear, we back away slowly and return to the cabin immediately." They ate a quick breakfast and prepared their gear for the hunt. William checked his rifle twice, ensuring it was loaded with high-caliber rounds designed for large game. He also distributed bear spray to both of them, though he knew it would be of limited use against a truly aggressive bear. The forest was eerily quiet as they began their trek toward the creek, where deer typically came to drink in the early morning hours. Every shadow seemed to hide potential danger. Every rustling leaf made them jump. 2 hours into their hunt, they found the first deer carcass. It had been a young buck, maybe 150 pounds, and it had been killed recently. The body was partially consumed, torn apart with a violence that spoke of immense power. Chunks of meat and hide were scattered across a 20-foot radius. "This is fresh," William said, his voice grim. "Maybe 6 hours old." Jacob stared at the carnage, his face pale. "The same bear from last night?" "Most likely." William studied the scene carefully. This wasn't normal feeding behavior. The kill had been made with excessive force, far more than necessary to subdue prey. It was almost as if the bear was enraged. They decided to abandon the hunting expedition and return to the cabin immediately. The presence of an aggressive bear in the area made it too dangerous to continue. But as they turned to leave, William spotted something that made his blood run cold. Fresh bear tracks led directly from the kill site toward their cabin. "We need to move." "Now," William said, shouldering his pack. They hiked back as quickly as possible, constantly looking over their shoulders and listening for sounds of pursuit. The forest seemed to close in around them, every tree a potential hiding place for death. When they reached the cabin, they found evidence that the bear had returned during their absence. The wooden shutters showed new claw marks, and garbage they had secured in a bear-proof container had been scattered around the clearing. "It's not just looking for food," William said, studying the damage. "It's specifically interested in us." Inside the cabin, William tried the radio, hoping to contact the authorities or arrange for early pickup. But the weather had taken a turn for the worse, with heavy cloud cover blocking most radio signals. They were on their own. That afternoon they stayed inside the cabin, taking turns watching the windows and checking their weapons. The bear appeared twice, first around 2 p.m., walking boldly through the clearing in broad daylight, and again near sunset, approaching within 20 feet of the front door. Each time, the animal's behavior was more disturbing. It showed no fear of human presence, no natural wariness that typically kept wild bears at a distance. Instead, it seemed curious about the cabin and its occupants, studying the structure as if calculating how to gain entry. "Dad, I think we should leave," Jacob said, as darkness fell on their second night. "Hike back to the airstrip and wait for pickup there." William considered it, but the airstrip was 10 miles away through dense forest, and traveling at night in bear territory was suicide. "We're safer here. This cabin has protected 3 generations of Turners. It'll protect us too." But even as he said it, William wasn't sure he believed it anymore. The second night was worse than the first. The bear returned around 11 p.m., and this time it was more aggressive. They could hear it testing the shutters, pushing against the reinforced door, and circling the cabin with increasing agitation. The sounds went on for hours. At one point, something crashed against the back wall with such force that the entire cabin shook. Jacob huddled in his sleeping bag, trying to control his panic, while William kept his rifle trained on the door. "What does it want?" Jacob whispered. William didn't have an answer. In all his years of hunting, he had never encountered a bear that behaved like this one. Normal bears were opportunistic feeders, interested in easy meals, and generally afraid of humans. This animal was something else entirely, focused, persistent, and seemingly unafraid. Around 3 a.m., the sound stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise had been. They waited, listening, but the forest had gone completely quiet. William dozed fitfully in his chair by the door, rifle across his lap. Jacob lay awake in his bunk, staring at the ceiling and counting the minutes until dawn. But dawn would bring no relief. The third day started with a discovery that changed everything. When William peered out the front window at first light, he saw that the bear had been busy during the quiet hours. Trees around the cabin had been clawed and marked at heights that seemed impossible. Scratch marks 8 feet off the ground, gouged deep into the bark. "Jesus Christ," William muttered, staring at the evidence of the animal's size and strength. But it was what they found at the tree line that truly terrified them. A pile of animal bones, deer, smaller bears, what looked like the remains of a moose, arranged in a rough circle around a central clearing. The bones were old, bleached white by weather, but they had been placed deliberately. "Bears don't do this," William said, his voice shaking. "This isn't normal behavior." Jacob stared at the macabre display, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we're dealing with something that doesn't follow the normal rules." By mid-morning, the weather had deteriorated into a full autumn storm. Sleet and snow reduced visibility to mere yards, and the wind howled through the trees with savage intensity. Any hope of radio contact was gone, and the possibility of hiking to safety had vanished with the storm. They were trapped. The bear seemed to sense their vulnerability. It appeared in the clearing around noon, standing upright in the swirling snow like some primordial nightmare. Even through the storm, they could see its massive outline, easily 9 feet tall and broad as a pickup truck. For several minutes, it simply stood there, facing the cabin, as if studying them through the reinforced windows. Then it dropped to all fours and began a systematic examination of the structure, testing every possible point of entry. The front door held firm despite repeated charges that shook the entire cabin. The shuttered windows resisted its claws, though the wood splintered under the assault. But the bear was learning, adapting, finding weaknesses. "The back wall," William said suddenly, remembering a section where his father had replaced rotting logs with slightly newer wood. "The construction isn't as solid there." They could hear the bear working at the back of the cabin now, tearing away, chinking between the logs, testing the strength of each beam. The sounds were methodical, patient, intelligent. "Why is it doing this?" Jacob asked, tears streaming down his face. William wished he had an answer. He had read about rogue animals, bears that developed an abnormal aggression toward humans, but this was beyond anything in his experience. This felt personal, targeted, as if the bear had chosen them specifically. As afternoon faded into evening, the storm intensified, but the weather that trapped them also seemed to drive the bear into a frenzy of activity. The attacks on the cabin became more frequent, more violent, more focused. The back wall began to show signs of structural damage. One of the logs had shifted enough to create a gap that let in cold air and snow. The bear seemed to sense this weakness and concentrated its efforts there. "We need to barricade that section," William said, dragging furniture against the compromised wall. They piled everything they could move, bunks, chairs, their supply boxes, against the back wall, creating a barrier that might buy them a few extra minutes when the bear finally broke through. Because by now, they both understood that it was a matter of when, not if. The radio crackled to life briefly around 8 p.m., and William managed to transmit a desperate distress call before the signal faded again. He wasn't sure if anyone had heard him or if help would be able to reach them through the storm, but it was their only hope. "Mayday, Mayday, this is William Turner at the Carlet Creek hunting cabin. We are under attack by an aggressive brown bear. The animal has us trapped and is attempting to breach our shelter. Request immediate assistance. 2 persons on site, adult male and juvenile male. We are armed but may not be able to hold position much longer." The response was garbled static. Night fell like a curtain, and with it came the bear's final assault. The animal had spent the day learning the cabin's weaknesses, and now it put that knowledge to devastating use. The attacks came in coordinated waves. Charges against the front door, followed immediately by attempts to breach the back wall, then systematic testing of the window shutters. The cabin, which had seemed so solid and secure just days earlier, began to come apart under the relentless assault. The back wall logs shifted further with each impact. The front door, despite its steel reinforcements, began to show stress fractures in the wood. William and Jacob huddled together in the center of the single room, their rifles ready, waiting for the inevitable breach. The sounds outside were deafening, the bear's roars of rage mixing with the crash of its body against the cabin walls, the screaming wind of the storm, the splintering of wood under impossible pressure. "I love you, son," William said, putting his arm around Jacob's shoulders. "Whatever happens, remember that your mother and I are proud of you." Jacob nodded, too scared to speak, his hands shaking as he gripped his rifle. The end came at 11:47 p.m. The back wall gave way with a sound like gunshots, logs splitting and tumbling inward. The furniture barricade collapsed as a massive paw, larger than a dinner plate, reached through the gap. William fired 3 shots in quick succession, and they heard the bear roar in pain and rage. But the wounds only seemed to enrage it further. The entire back wall began to collapse as the animal forced its way through, its bulk too large for the opening it had created. In the chaos that followed, as timber and debris filled the air, Jacob lost sight of his father. He heard 2 more gunshots, then a scream that he would remember for the rest of his life, however long that might be. The bear was inside the cabin now, its massive form filling the small space, its eyes reflecting the light from the overturned propane lantern. It stood upright, its head brushing the ceiling, and looked directly at Jacob with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Jacob raised his rifle with trembling hands and fired. The bullet struck the bear in the shoulder, and it dropped to all fours with a bellow that shook the remaining walls. But instead of retreating, it charged. The impact sent Jacob flying across the room. His rifle clattered away into the darkness, and he found himself pressed against the front wall with nowhere to run. The bear approached slowly now, as if savoring the moment. Its breathing labored from its wounds, but its determination undiminished. In the flickering light from the scattered propane flame, Jacob could see his father's motionless form, partially buried under the collapsed wall timbers. Blood spread in a dark pool around his head. The bear towered over Jacob, its massive paws on either side of his body, its breath hot and fetid on his face. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they stared at each other, predator and prey, ancient instinct and modern intelligence locked in a confrontation that could have only one outcome. Jacob closed his eyes and thought of his mother, of summer days fishing with his father, of all the life he would never live. He waited for the end, but the end didn't come. Instead, he heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the storm. The search and rescue helicopter from the Coast Guard station at Kodiak had been dispatched after receiving William's fragmentary distress call. Despite the dangerous weather conditions, the crew had decided to attempt a night rescue operation, guided by the GPS coordinates from the cabin's emergency beacon. The sound of the approaching aircraft sent the bear into a defensive rage. It backed away from Jacob, roaring at this new threat from above, its attention temporarily diverted from its intended prey. Jacob didn't waste the opportunity. He rolled toward where he thought his rifle had fallen, his hands desperately searching through the debris and darkness. His fingers closed around the familiar weight of the weapon just as the helicopter's searchlight blazed through the ruined cabin walls. The bear, caught in the brilliant beam, reared up on its hind legs and roared its defiance at the mechanical intruder. In that moment, illuminated against the snow and wreckage, it looked less like an animal and more like some primordial god of the wilderness, magnificent and terrible in its power. Jacob raised the rifle and fired his last 3 shots center mass. The bear staggered, blood frothing from its mouth, but it didn't fall. Instead, it turned its attention back to Jacob with a look of such pure malice that the boy's blood turned to ice. The helicopter was directly overhead now, its downdraft scattering debris and snow throughout the ruined cabin. Rescue personnel were preparing to fast rope down to the scene, but they would be too late. The bear took 2 steps toward Jacob, its movements unsteady but still purposeful. Its wounds were mortal, but it had enough life left to finish what it had started. Jacob scrambled backward, his hand closing around a piece of broken timber. It wasn't much of a weapon against a creature of such size and power, but it was all he had left. The bear raised one massive paw, claws extended, preparing for the killing blow. Jacob raised the timber defensively, knowing it would do little good, but unable to simply surrender. The shot that ended it all came from above. Coast Guard rescue swimmer, Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez, had rappelled down from the helicopter, armed with a high-powered rifle, specifically designed for dangerous wildlife encounters. His first shot took the bear through the skull, dropping the massive animal instantly. The sudden silence after the bear's death was deafening. Only the sound of the helicopter rotors and the whistling wind through the destroyed cabin walls broke the stillness. Jacob sat in the wreckage, covered in blood, both his own and the bear's, staring at the enormous carcass that lay just feet away. He was alive, but the cost had been everything. Senior Chief Rodriguez dropped into the cabin, his weapon still at the ready in case the bear wasn't truly dead. "Son, are you hurt? Can you move?" Jacob nodded numbly, unable to find his voice. He pointed toward the collapsed timbers where his father lay buried. It took 20 minutes to extract William Turner's body from the debris. He had died from massive trauma to the head and chest, his rifle still clutched in his hands. He had fought to the end, trying to protect his son. The rescue operation continued through the night and into the following day. Additional personnel were airlifted to the scene to process the attack site, remove the bodies, and investigate what had caused such aggressive behavior in the bear. The animal was a mature male Kodiak bear, estimated to weigh over 1,400 pounds, one of the largest ever recorded. Preliminary examination revealed old gunshot scars and evidence of previous encounters with humans, suggesting it may have been wounded in the past and developed an abnormal fear-aggression response. But that clinical explanation would never fully capture the terror of those 3 days, or explain why this particular bear had seemed to single out the Turner family with such focused malice. Jacob Turner was airlifted to Providence, Alaska Medical Center in Anchorage, where he was treated for hypothermia, lacerations, and severe psychological trauma. Physically, his injuries were relatively minor. Some cuts from flying debris, bruises from being thrown around the cabin, and the effects of 3 days of extreme stress and cold. Psychologically, the damage would take much longer to heal. Dr. Sarah Chen, the trauma psychiatrist assigned to Jacob's case, had seen many patients suffering from wilderness attack trauma, but few cases as severe as this one. The boy barely spoke for the first week of his hospitalization, communicating only through nods and shakes of his head. It's not unusual for survivors of predator attacks to experience severe PTSD, Dr. Chen explained to Jacob's mother, Sarah Turner, who had flown up from Seattle as soon as she received word of the attack. The primitive fear response triggered by such encounters can be overwhelming, especially for someone his age. Sarah Turner had collapsed when she received the news. Her worst fears about the hunting trip had come true, but in ways she could never have imagined. William was dead, killed by the wilderness he had loved so much, and their son was traumatized in ways that might never fully heal. "Will he be okay?" she asked, though she already knew there was no simple answer to that question. "Recovery from this kind of trauma is a long process," Dr. Chen said gently. "He's alive, which is remarkable given what he went through. But he'll need extensive therapy and support to work through the psychological effects." The media attention was immediate and intense. The story of a father and son attacked by a giant Kodiak bear captured national attention, with news crews descending on Kodiak Island and later following the family back to Seattle. "Horror in Alaska. Teen survives monster bear attack that killed his father," read the headline in the Seattle Times. Other newspapers picked up the story with increasingly sensationalized versions of events. Jacob refused all interview requests, but that didn't stop reporters from camping outside their home and hounding the family for details about the attack. The attention only added to Jacob's trauma, making him feel even more isolated and vulnerable. The investigation by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game concluded that the bear had likely been defending a territory it had claimed around the cabin area. Evidence suggested it had been in the region for several weeks, possibly driven from its normal range by competition from other bears or changes in food availability. Wildlife biologist Dr. Amanda Foster, who led the investigation team, noted several unusual aspects of the case. The level of focused aggression displayed by this animal was extraordinary. Most bear attacks are defensive in nature or result from surprise encounters. This bear exhibited behavior more consistent with a territorial predator marking and defending a specific area. The official report recommended that the hunting cabin area be closed to public access for at least 2 years, while wildlife patterns in the region stabilized. The Turner family's hunting lease was permanently revoked, though by that point, none of them had any desire to return to Kodiak Island. Back in Seattle, Jacob began the long process of recovery. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a specialist in trauma therapy, worked with him 3 times a week, using a combination of traditional talk therapy and newer techniques designed to help process severe traumatic memories. The mind has ways of protecting itself from experiences too overwhelming to process normally, Dr. Vasquez explained. Jacob's brain essentially shut down many of his emotional responses during the attack as a survival mechanism. Now we need to help him safely access and work through those memories. The nightmares were the worst part. Night after night, Jacob would wake screaming, reliving the moments when the bear broke through the cabin wall, when he saw his father disappear under the falling timbers, when those massive claws reached for him in the darkness. Sleep became the enemy. Jacob would stay awake for days at a time, surviving on caffeine and terror, until exhaustion finally overcame his fear and he collapsed into restless sleep filled with brown fur and glowing eyes. His grades plummeted. Friends stopped calling. The normal activities of teenage life seemed impossibly trivial after facing death in its most primal form. How could he care about homework or basketball or girls when he had stared into the face of pure predatory malice and barely survived? Sarah Turner struggled with her own trauma and grief while trying to support her son's recovery. She blamed herself for allowing the trip, blamed William for insisting on family tradition over safety, blamed the Wilderness Service for not providing better warnings about aggressive bear activity. "I should have put my foot down," she told Dr. Chen during one of Jacob's therapy sessions. "I knew something felt wrong about this trip. William was so excited about taking Jacob, about continuing the family tradition. But I had this feeling of dread from the beginning. The family tradition that had meant so much to 3 generations of Turner men had ended in tragedy. The hunting rifles were sold, the camping gear donated to charity, and the family photos from previous trips were packed away in storage where they couldn't trigger painful memories. 6 months after the attack, Jacob still couldn't bring himself to go camping or even spend time outdoors alone. The sight of wooded areas, the sound of wind through trees, even nature documentaries on television could trigger panic attacks that left him hyperventilating and shaking. "Recovery isn't linear," Dr. Vasquez reminded both Jacob and his mother during their sessions. "There will be good days and bad days, progress and setbacks. The goal isn't to forget what happened or to go back to exactly who you were before. The goal is to integrate this experience into your life in a way that allows you to move forward." The legal aftermath was complicated. The Turner family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the state of Alaska, alleging that inadequate warnings about aggressive bear activity in the area had contributed to William's death. The case dragged on for 2 years, with wildlife experts testifying about the unpredictable nature of bear behavior and the inherent risks of wilderness activities. Eventually, the case was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. The money helped pay for Jacob's ongoing therapy and provided some financial security for the family, but it couldn't bring back William or erase the trauma of those 3 days in October. As Jacob's 18th birthday approached, he faced decisions about his future that seemed impossibly difficult. College applications asked about his interests and goals, but how could he explain that his primary interest was simply surviving each day without being overwhelmed by memories of claws and teeth and the sound of his father's final scream? He chose a small college in urban Phoenix, as far from wilderness as he could get. The idea of mountains or forests or even large parks filled him with anxiety, but the desert landscape of Arizona felt safe, open, with no places for large predators to hide. Dr. Vasquez supported the decision. Sometimes healing requires us to create new environments where we can rebuild our sense of safety and control. You've survived something that would have broken many people. Now you get to decide who you want to become. The Turner family story became part of Alaska's folklore, retold around campfires and in hunting lodges as a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating wilderness predators. But for Jacob, it wasn't folklore or entertainment. It was the defining experience of his life, the moment when childhood ended and he learned that the world contained forces beyond human control or understanding. 3 years after the attack, Jacob was able to tell his story to a support group for trauma survivors. Standing in a circle of folding chairs in a Phoenix community center, surrounded by people who had faced their own forms of horror, he finally found words for what he had experienced. "People asked me what it was like, facing that bear," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "They want to know if I was brave, if I fought back, if I felt like a hero for surviving. But the truth is, I felt small and helpless and absolutely terrified. The bear wasn't just an animal. It was like facing the embodiment of everything dangerous and unpredictable about the natural world." He paused, looking around at the faces of his fellow survivors, people who had survived car crashes, violent crimes, natural disasters, and other traumas that had reshaped their lives. "But I did survive," he continued, "and I'm still here, still learning how to live with what happened. My father didn't survive, and I carry that with me every day. But I also carry the knowledge that I face something most people can't even imagine, and I'm still standing." The group session ended with Jacob feeling something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of connection to other people who understood what it meant to have your life divided into before and after by a single traumatic event. Dr. Vasquez, who had attended the session, walked with Jacob to his car afterward. "How did that feel?" she asked. "Scary," Jacob admitted, "but also relieving, I guess, to be able to say it out loud without falling apart. That's significant progress. You've come a very long way from the boy who couldn't speak for a week after the attack." Jacob nodded, looking out at the desert landscape that had become his refuge. "I still can't imagine ever going camping again or even hiking in the woods, but maybe I don't have to. Maybe it's okay to live a different kind of life than what I thought I wanted before." The anniversary of the attack still hit hard every October 21st. Jacob would take the day off from school or work, allowing himself to feel the full weight of the memories without trying to push them away. Sarah Turner would visit William's grave, sometimes accompanied by Jacob, but often alone, carrying the guilt and grief that would never fully leave her. But there were also moments of unexpected healing. Jacob discovered a talent for photography, finding beauty and meaning in urban landscapes and desert sunsets. He volunteered with a local crisis hotline, using his experience with trauma to help others in their darkest moments. He even began dating, finding someone who could accept the parts of his past that would always be with him. 5 years after the attack, Jacob received a letter from Senior Chief Rodriguez, the Coast Guard rescue swimmer who had saved his life. They had maintained sporadic contact over the years, and Rodriguez had followed Jacob's recovery with the professional interest of someone who had seen many trauma victims in his career. "I wanted you to know that I think about that night often," Rodriguez wrote, "not just because of the dramatic nature of the rescue, but because of the courage you showed. You were just a kid, and you had already lost your father, but you never gave up. You kept fighting even when it seemed hopeless. That takes a special kind of strength." The letter meant more to Jacob than any medal or commendation could have. To be recognized not as a victim but as a survivor, not as someone to be pitied, but as someone who had faced unimaginable circumstances with courage, helped reshape how he saw himself and his experience. By his 21st birthday, Jacob had decided to pursue a degree in psychology with a focus on trauma therapy. His own experience had shown him both the devastating impact of severe trauma and the possibility of recovery and growth. He wanted to help other people navigate their own journeys from victim to survivor. "It's not about getting over what happened," he explained to his mother over dinner on his birthday. "It's about integrating it into who I am in a way that makes me stronger and more compassionate. Dad always said that hard experiences either break you or make you stronger. I'm choosing to be stronger." Sarah Turner smiled, seeing echoes of her late husband's determination in their son's words. William would have been proud of the young man Jacob had become, shaped by tragedy but not defined by it. The Kodiak bear that had destroyed their family and nearly taken Jacob's life had been motivated by instincts and behaviors that scientists could analyze but never fully explain. But in the end, the bear's legacy wasn't just destruction and death. It was also a testament to human resilience, to the capacity to survive unimaginable horror and find ways to rebuild and grow. Jacob Turner carried scars that would never fully heal, memories that would always have the power to wake him in the middle of the night. But he also carried the knowledge that he had faced the worst the world could offer and emerged with his humanity intact. In a universe that could be cruel and unpredictable, that was no small victory. The wilderness of Kodiak Island continued its eternal cycles, indifferent to human tragedy. Other hunters came and went, most never knowing the story of what had happened at the remote cabin by Karluk Lake. The forest reclaimed the clearing where the cabin had stood, and nature erased most traces of that terrible October night. But for Jacob Turner, the memory would always be vivid. The sound of splintering wood, the sight of his father's courage in the face of impossible odds, the feeling of staring into the face of death and somehow living to tell about it. It was a story he would carry for the rest of his life. A reminder that survival sometimes comes at a cost that can never be fully calculated, but must somehow be borne with grace and determination. In the end, the bear had taken much from the Turner family, but it had not taken everything. Jacob's survival was more than just biological. It was a triumph of will, of the human capacity to endure and adapt and find meaning, even in the darkest circumstances. The boy who had entered that cabin as a child seeking adventure had emerged as a young man who understood both the beauty and terror of existence, and who chose to use that knowledge to help others find their own paths through trauma toward healing. The story of the Kodiak bear attack would be remembered and retold, but Jacob Turner's story, the story of survival and recovery and growth, continued to be written with each day he chose to keep living, keep helping others, and keep believing in the possibility of hope, even after horror.